Hey guys, tonight we begin with the extraordinary story of Alexander the Great, a young king who at only 20 years old led his armies beyond the familiar horizon, where one man's life was measured in dusty roads and endless marches, while another's was defined by golden palaces and the weight of empires. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Close your eyes now, if you wish, and imagine a world more than 2,000 years ago. A world where the lands we know today as Greece, Turkey, Iran, and India were stitched together not by railways or airplanes, but by long roads, mountains, and seas. It was a time when gods were thought to walk among men, when oracles whispered destinies, and when the name of a young Macedonian prince would echo across centuries. This young prince was Alexander, son of King Philip II of Macedonia. To many Greeks of the southern city-states, Macedonia had long seemed like a rugged backwater, a mountainous land of shepherds and warriors. They looked down on it as crude, almost unworthy of being called Greek. But under the guidance of Philip, Alexander's father, Macedonia was rising into a formidable power. Philip had reorganized the army, equipping them with the mighty sarissa, a spear nearly twice the length of what other Greeks carried. With this innovation and a keen mind for strategy, Philip had subdued most of the Greek city-states, creating a new league under his command. But before Philip could lead his people against the mighty Persian Empire, fate struck. One evening, as he walked into a theatre in Aegae, Philip was murdered by one of his own bodyguards. Whispers spread. Perhaps it was revenge, perhaps political intrigue, whatever the truth. The throne passed to Alexander, just 20 years old, young, restless, but already shaped by the teachings of the philosopher Aristotle and the harsh lessons of the battlefield. Alexander was ready to step into history. Imagine him in those first days, the son of a slain king, facing rivals at home who doubted his right to rule, facing Greek cities like Thebes that rebelled, testing his resolve. Yet Alexander wasted no time. He struck with the speed of a hawk, crushing his enemies and burning Thebes to the ground. Those who survived were sold into slavery, a grim warning to anyone who might question his authority. And then, having secured his homeland, he turned his gaze eastward, across the Aegean Sea, toward the vast Persian Empire. The Persians were no ordinary foe. For generations, they had been the superpower of the world, stretching from modern-day Turkey to the rivers of India, from Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia. Their armies were vast, their kings worshipped as divine, their wealth beyond counting. To most Greeks, the thought of challenging Persia seemed madness. But Alexander had inherited his father's dream, to unite the Greeks in a great campaign, to take revenge for the Persian invasions of the past, and to seize the treasures of Asia for himself. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander marched, with about 40,000 men, soldiers from Macedonia, allies from across Greece, mercenaries lured by pay. He crossed the narrow strait of the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He paused at the site of ancient Troy, honouring the memory of Achilles, his hero, laying a wreath on the tomb of the great warrior of legend. In that gesture, he tied his destiny to the stories of old, as if to say, I, too, will be remembered among the immortals. Now picture his army. In the front line stood the phalangites, professional soldiers carrying the 18-foot sarissa. They marched shoulder to shoulder, forming a bristling wall of spear points that advanced like an iron porcupine. Beside them were the hippospists, elite shield-bearers, ready to guard the flanks with their shorter spears. Behind came hoplites from other Greek states, mercenaries with heavy shields and sturdy armour. Around them moved light troops, javelin throwers, slingers, archers, men who could harass an enemy from afar. And then, the pride of Macedonia, the companion cavalry. These were noble horsemen, clad in armour, wielding long lances, riding with Alexander himself at their head. In all, the force was not the largest the world had seen, but it was disciplined, loyal, and above all, led by a man who believed destiny itself rode with him. The Persian governors of Asia Minor gathered to oppose him. Among them was a Greek general, Memnon of Rhodes, who served the Persians with skill and caution. He urged his fellow commanders not to meet Alexander in battle, but to burn the land, retreat, and starve him out. Yet the satraps of Persia were unwilling to sacrifice their provinces. They would meet this Macedonian boy in open battle, at the river Granicus, The Granicus was not deep, but its banks were steep, and across it stood the Persian cavalry, a glittering line of horsemen from every corner of the empire, Medes and Hyrcanians from Persia, Bactrians from the east, Paphlagonians from the Black Sea coast. Behind them waited infantry, including Greek mercenaries. The Persians were confident. They had numbers, and they had the advantage of terrain. Surely, they thought, this rash young king would be crushed. Alexander, however, would not wait. Ignoring advice to delay, he ordered an immediate assault. The sun was sinking, shadows stretching across the river, as the Macedonian cavalry splashed into the water. Arrows and javelins rained down. Horses stumbled on the slippery rocks, but Alexander, riding in person at the front of his companion cavalry, urged his men forward. "Follow me," he cried, and his golden helmet flashed in the fading light as he clashed with the Persians on the opposite bank. The fight was brutal, chaos of hooves and steel. At one moment, a Persian noble struck Alexander's head so fiercely that his helmet split, but Alexander drove his lance into his attacker's chest. Another enemy raised a sword to strike from behind, only to have his arm severed by Black Clitus, one of Alexander's loyal companions. Around them, Macedonian and Persian horses collided. Men shouted, fell, and drowned in the current, but gradually the weight of the Macedonian phalanx pushed across. Row upon row of spear points emerged from the river, advancing, relentless, impossible to stop. The Persian cavalry broke, fleeing across the fields. The mercenaries who remained behind were slaughtered without mercy. Alexander had won his first great victory. With Asia Minor open before him, Alexander marched deeper. Cities fell, some surrendering, others resisting and being crushed. At Gordium, he faced the legendary Gordian knot, a tangled rope said to be impossible to untie, with prophecy claiming that whoever solved it would rule Asia. Alexander did not waste time fumbling. He drew his sword and sliced through it with one stroke. Whether seen as cleverness or sacrilege, it was a symbolic act. Alexander would not be bound by tradition. He would cut his own path to destiny. Yet Persia was not defeated. In 333 BC, King Darius III himself gathered a massive army, far larger than Alexander's, and moved to trap him near the coastal plain of Issus. The Persian host may have numbered 100,000 men, cavalry, infantry, the famed immortals, all arrayed in glittering lines across the narrow plain. Darius placed himself in the centre, surrounded by his household guard. To the Greeks, this battlefield looked like doom. Alexander was outnumbered nearly 2-1, but the narrowness of the land, mountains to one side, sea to the other, worked in Alexander's favour. He arranged his troops. Parmenion, his trusted general, commanded the left wing, while Alexander took the right, leading his companions once again. The phalanx advanced, its lines gleaming under the grey sky. At first, the Persian cavalry pressed Parmenion hard, threatening to break through, but Alexander, seeing the enemy's centre exposed, charged straight at Darius. It was a daring move. The companions thundered forward, spears lowered, the Persian infantry wavered. Alexander drove his horse directly toward the royal chariot, and in that moment, the great king faltered. Darius turned and fled. The Persian army, seeing their king depart, broke into panic. Thousands died in the rout, and the Greeks filled ravines with the bodies of their enemies to march onward. It was a massacre, but also a stunning victory. Alexander had shattered Persia's main army and captured Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children, whom he treated with unexpected dignity. They were kept safe and honoured, a gesture that revealed both Alexander's pride and his cunning. To win Asia, he knew he needed to appear not only as a conqueror, but as a king worthy of loyalty. As the months passed, Alexander's legend grew. In Egypt, weary of Persian rule, the people hailed him as a liberator. Priests crowned him pharaoh at Memphis and at the desert oracle of Siwa. He was welcomed as the son of Amun, a god among men. By the Nile Delta, he founded a new city, Alexandria, which in time would become one of the greatest centres of knowledge and culture in the ancient world. But already his eyes looked east, toward Darius, who still lived and rallied his empire for one last stand. Alexander did not linger long in Egypt, though the desert winds might have tempted him to rest. For while the Nile cradled him in its ancient arms, Darius was gathering strength once again. The great king had called forth soldiers from every corner of his empire, men of Persia, Babylonia, Media, Armenia, and beyond, even war chariots with scythed wheels. and the heavy tread of elephants were being assembled. This would not be a skirmish on a riverbank. It would be the battle that would decide the fate of Asia. The two armies met on the plains near a village called Gaugamela. The field was vast, open, carefully chosen by Darius so his numbers might matter. His engineers had cleared the ground of stones and obstacles, preparing it for the charge of his chariots. Estimates vary, but some say his host was double the size of Alexander's. Perhaps more. It stretched across the horizon, an ocean of spears and banners shimmering in the heat. Alexander, by contrast, brought perhaps 40,000 men, veterans, disciplined, hardened by years of campaigning, but still only a fraction of the Persian tide. Yet he had more than soldiers. He had belief, his own and that which he inspired in his men. They had followed him across mountains and rivers, through battles where the odds had seemed impossible, and each time they had emerged victorious. By now, they trusted not only his skill, but the strange aura that seemed to cling to him. Perhaps the gods themselves walked beside their young king. On that morning, Alexander drew up his troops in familiar order. To the left, near the river, stood Parmenion with the Thessalian cavalry and allied Greeks. In the centre, the phalanx, their sarissas pointed like a forest bristling with steel. On the right, Alexander himself, with his companions, hippospists, archers, and light troops. Behind, a second line of Greek hoplites angled back, protecting against the encircling manoeuvres the Persians were sure to attempt. The ground trembled as the battle began. Alexander rode to the right, moving his wing outward, as though seeking to circle around the Persians. Darius, watching, mirrored the move, sending cavalry to block him. The lines stretched, shifted, thinned, and then, at the precise moment when the Persian centre was weakened, Alexander struck. With a cry, he led his companions in a thunderous charge, straight into the heart of the Persian line. The clash was terrible. Chariots swept forward, but the Macedonians opened lanes, letting the horses gallop through harmlessly, while javelins cut down their riders. The phalanx pressed ahead, their long spears driving back the enemy, and Alexander, gleaming at the head of his cavalry, carved a path toward Darius's chariot. The great king, seeing the furious assault, once again faltered. Fear overtook him. He turned his horses and fled the battlefield. Panic rippled through the Persian ranks. Though pockets of cavalry still fought desperately, the centre crumbled. Victory belonged to Alexander. According to ancient writers, the Macedonians lost only a few hundred men, while tens of thousands of Persians lay slain or scattered. The road to the Persian heartlands now lay open. When Alexander entered Babylon, he was welcomed as a king. Rich gifts poured into his hands: gold, jewels, fine robes, animals from distant lands. At Susa, another capital, he sat upon the throne of the Achaemenid kings, claiming it now as his own. Yet his triumph was not without shadows. In the mountains at the Persian gates, defenders held a pass with desperate courage, holding up Alexander's army for a month until he found a way around to encircle them. Only then did the gate open, stained with blood. At last, he reached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. The palaces there stood like dreams carved into stone, pillars soaring, reliefs of kings and warriors etched in marble, treasures gleaming in storerooms. Alexander at first wished to present himself as a rightful heir, a liberator rather than a destroyer. But memories of the Persian invasion of Greece, of Athens burned nearly 2 centuries earlier, stirred among his men. One night, after heavy drinking, torches were cast, and the palaces of Persepolis were engulfed in flames. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying with it the last breath of Persian pride. To this day, scholars argue whether it was vengeance or folly, but in that fire, the old empire was symbolically ended. Still, Darius lived, fleeing deeper into his realm, seeking allies, raising fresh troops. Alexander pursued, determined to capture him, yet fate intervened. In the royal city of Ecbatana, Darius was betrayed by one of his own governors. Bessus, the once mighty king, was murdered and left in chains, his body presented as a token to Alexander. The Macedonian, though his enemy was gone, ordered that Darius be buried with honour among the tombs of his ancestors. It was both a gesture of respect and a proclamation. Alexander was no mere invader. He was now the rightful ruler of Persia. But the death of Darius did not end Alexander's campaigns. Bessus declared himself king in the eastern provinces, and rebellion spread in the rugged lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, where mountains and rivers offered shelter to those who resisted. Alexander pressed on. marching his weary troops farther and farther east. He founded cities, Alexandrias he called them, planting seeds of Greek culture in the soil of Asia. Some of these cities would endure for centuries, crossroads of trade and knowledge. Others would vanish into dust. The years that followed were harsh. Guerrilla wars in distant valleys, ambushes in the mountains, betrayals and conspiracies among his own men. The further Alexander went, the more alien the world became to his soldiers, and the more restless they grew, for they had not seen their homes in years. Their king, meanwhile, was changing. He began to adopt Persian dress and customs, to sit on the throne as an Eastern monarch rather than as a Greek general. He even demanded proskynesis, the ritual prostration that Greeks believed should be reserved for the gods. To many of his companions, this was unbearable. Murmurs of discontent grew. Tensions boiled over in tragic moments. Clytus the Black, a seasoned general who once saved Alexander's life at Granicus, clashed with him in a drunken quarrel. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and Alexander, in a burst of fury, killed Clytus with his own hand. The king was stricken with remorse, shutting himself away for days. But the act could not be undone. It was as if conquest was changing him, pulling him away from the friends and culture of his youth. Yet even in these dark times, new bonds were formed, in Bactria. Alexander married Roxana, the beautiful daughter of a nobleman. Their union was more than affection. It was also a political gesture, binding him to the land he sought to rule. Roxana would travel with him on his long journeys, sharing in his triumphs and his griefs. By 327 BC, Alexander turned his gaze still further east, beyond Persia, toward the mysterious lands of India. To reach them, he led his army across the mighty Hindu Kush mountains, through snow and hardship, down into the fertile valleys watered by the Indus. Here he faced Porus, king of the Pauravas, who brought to the battlefield a terrifying force, war elephants. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, the earth shook with their charge, tusks gleaming, riders hurling spears from their backs. Macedonian horses panicked at the sight and smell of the beasts. Casualties were heavy, the fighting bitter, but in the end, Alexander prevailed. And yet, in victory, he showed a different side. Porus, though defeated, was treated with honour. When asked how he wished to be treated, the proud king replied, "Like a king." Alexander smiled and granted him his lands back, enlarged even, making him an ally rather than a subject. It was a mark of the flexibility that had made Alexander not just a conqueror, but a ruler of many peoples. Still, the dream of endless conquest was wearing thin. His men, exhausted and far from home, finally mutinied on the banks of the river Beas. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and now, hearing rumours of even greater armies further east, they refused to go on. Alexander raged, pleaded, even sulked in his tent. But in the end he was forced to turn back. The edge of the world, as the Greeks imagined it, would remain just beyond his grasp. The return journey was brutal. Through the Punjab, across deserts, down rivers, the army suffered. In the Gadrosian desert, men and animals alike perished under the burning sun, their bones left on the sands. At last, they staggered back into Persia, scarred but unbroken. Alexander had conquered more than any king before him. His empire stretched from Greece to the Indus, from Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia. It was vast, dazzling and fragile. In Susa, he attempted to bind Macedonians and Persians together. A mass wedding was arranged. 80 Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen in one grand ceremony. Alexander himself took additional Persian brides, though his heart remained with Roxana. He ordered thousands of youths trained in Macedonian warfare, hoping to forge a new generation loyal to him alone. But these gestures also alienated many of his countrymen, who feared their king was forgetting who he truly was. And then, tragedy struck. At Ecbatana, his closest companion, Hephaestion, fell ill with fever and died. The grief that overcame Alexander was immense. He fasted, wept, and ordered public mourning across the empire. Some say his sorrow was deeper than any wound he'd suffered in battle. For years they had been inseparable, friend, general, confidant. Now, in the silence that followed, Alexander seemed lonelier than ever. He did not stop, however, even as embassies from distant lands came to honour him. Libyans, Scythians, even tribes from far off Europe. He was planning new campaigns, to Arabia and beyond, The world was not enough, but in Babylon, in the summer heat of 323 BC, he was struck by a sudden fever. For days he burned, unable to speak, unable to rise. His generals asked who should succeed him. According to some, he whispered only, "To the strongest." Then, at just 32 years of age, Alexander the Great was gone. His empire did not long survive him. His generals, the Diadochi, carved it into pieces, fighting bitter wars among themselves. His wife Roxana and their infant son were murdered. Even his golden coffin, meant to return to Macedonia, was stolen and ended up in Egypt, where it vanished into history. And yet, though his empire fractured, his name endured. For Alexander had done more than win battles. He had carried Greek ideas across Asia, mingling them with the traditions of Persia, Egypt, and India. In cities he founded, knowledge blossomed, sciences flourished, cultures blended. This Hellenistic age would shape the world for centuries. And so, tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine that young man on horseback, his cloak snapping in the wind, eyes fixed on horizons no one else dared to reach. Imagine the sound of hooves across plains, the gleam of torches against palace walls, the hush of desert sands under stars. His life was brief, fierce, flawed, but unforgettable. He remains, across time, Alexander the Great. When we left Alexander, the fever had taken him in Babylon. He was just 32, a man who had never lost a battle, a man whose will seemed as indestructible as the walls of Persepolis. His death, sudden and mysterious, left his empire without a guide, and yet, the story does not end in that moment, for Alexander's legacy, like a fire set to dry grass, spread in every direction. It flickered in the hearts of his generals, in the streets of the cities he founded, and in the quiet whispers of scholars and poets who lived long after him. Imagine the scene in Babylon. The palace rooms are heavy with the scent of incense, voices hushed, soldiers pacing in anxious silence. Alexander lies motionless, his body frail, but his name already greater than any man alive. His officers, men who had fought with him from the crossing at the Hellespont, through the dust of Issus and the reign of Gaugamela, now stand uncertain. Who will rule? To whom has the empire been entrusted? Some say Alexander's voice, weak and fading, uttered the words, "To the strongest." Others claim he passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, hinting that he should act as regent, no matter what the truth was. When the king's eyes closed for the last time, the world seemed to exhale in shock, and then came the silence of confusion. His empire was vast but fragile, stitched together only by his charisma, his victories, and the awe he commanded. Without him, it was like a ship with no captain, tossed between jealous currents. His generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, looked at one another with suspicion. Each had ambition, each had pride. They had followed Alexander, but none could equal him. The age that followed would be called the Wars of the Successors, a turbulent time when comrades turned against comrades, and Alexander's dream shattered into shards of kingdoms. Yet before we dive into that storm, let us linger on what Alexander left behind. Close your eyes and see the map of his conquests, from the rugged hills of Macedonia, across the Aegean into Asia Minor, south to the sands of Egypt, east to the valleys of the Indus River, thousands of miles. A sweep of empire so broad that even the Persian kings before him had not imagined it unified under one man. He had carved this dominion not over decades, but in just 10 years. His was a life lived in the rush of storm winds, not the slow drift of seasons. Think of the cities: Alexandria by the Nile, Alexandria and Arachosia, Alexandria Ashate at the edge of Central Asia. They were seeds scattered across the earth, some sprouting into centres of trade and learning, others fading into dust. The greatest, Alexandria in Egypt, would shine as a beacon for centuries, its library gathering the knowledge of the world, its lighthouse guiding sailors across the Mediterranean. Through these foundations, Alexander's spirit lingered, long after the dust of his empire had settled. Now imagine the soldiers, the veterans who had marched with him. They had crossed deserts, fought elephants, stood against impossible odds. Many were weary, homesick, burdened with memories of comrades lost. They had loved their king, but also feared him. For in his later years he had seemed to stand apart, more a god than a man. Now, with him gone, they faced a question too heavy to answer. Had it all been worth it? Was the suffering of the Gedrosian desert, the the blood spilled at Hydaspes, the years of exile from hearth and family, redeemed by the glory of Alexander's vision? Or had they followed a star too bright, a star that burned itself out too soon? And what of Roxana, his young wife? She was pregnant when he died, carrying the child who might have united the empire. For a time, hope rested on her, but the world was harsh, and power-hungry men circled like wolves. Roxana's fate and that of her infant son would be bound up in the struggles of Alexander's successors, their lives cut short by ambition and betrayal. It is a sombre reminder that glory often leaves shadows where it passes. As the empire fractured, the successors carved realms for themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt, where he founded a dynasty that would last for centuries, its most famous queen one day being Cleopatra. Seleucus claimed vast territories in Asia, stretching from Syria to the borders of India, a mosaic of cultures bound under his rule. Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander all claimed their shares, all waged wars, all dreamed of being the new Alexander, but none could fill his place. The legend of Alexander was too immense, too luminous. He had been not just a conqueror, but a symbol. The successors, for all their victories, remained men of ordinary limits. Still, the world was changed forever. Greek ideas flowed east, blending with Persian and Egyptian traditions. Sculptors carved in marble and stone, blending styles of east and west. Philosophers debated under palm trees in lands once ruled by kings of Asia. Soldiers trained in Macedonian fashion, even as they spoke tongues unknown in Greece. Out of Alexander's whirlwind came the Hellenistic age, a time when cultures mingled, when the known world grew richer and stranger, when boundaries blurred. Let us drift back, though, to the boy he once was. Before the crowns and the battles, Alexander was a child in Pella, Macedonia's capital. His tutor was Aristotle, the great philosopher, who taught him about ethics, politics, and the natural world. It is said Aristotle instilled in him a love of knowledge that never left him. Even on campaign, Alexander carried scrolls, read Homer's Iliad, and spoke with scholars he encountered. Perhaps it was this mixture, the sword in one hand, the book in the other, that made him unique. He was no brute conqueror. He was curious, restless, eager to see what lay beyond the horizon, eager to shape the world as he dreamed it could be. And perhaps that is why his soldiers followed him. Not only because he was fearless in battle, riding always at the front, sharing their dangers, but because he seemed to embody a vision larger than himself. He spoke of a world united, not divided by narrow loyalties. He spoke of being not just Macedonian or Greek, but part of something greater, something universal. For a moment in history, under the blaze of his star, such a world seemed possible. Now, as you rest tonight, think of him not just as the fierce warrior charging at Gaugamela, but as the restless dreamer staring at the stars above his tent, wondering if the gods whispered his name. Think of the silence that followed his death, when men stood by his bed in Babylon, unable to imagine a world without him. Think of the stories told in taverns and marketplaces for centuries afterward, the young king who crossed deserts, who never lost a battle, who died too soon. Alexander's life reminds us of both the brilliance and the fragility of human ambition. He achieved what no one else dared, yet in doing so, he left behind an empire too vast for any one man to hold. His victories echo, but so do the tragedies, the friends he killed in anger, the people he enslaved, the cities he burned. He was not a god, though some believed he was. He was human, flawed, radiant, and unforgettable. So let the story soften now, like a fading fire. Let the battles grow distant, like thunder beyond the mountains. What remains is the image of a young man on horseback, cloak flowing, eyes alight with visions that reach beyond the edge of the world. And though his empire crumbled, though his name was cursed by some and praised by others, his legend became eternal. He was Alexander the Great, a man who dared to grasp the impossible, and for a fleeting moment held it in his hands. Picture again the vast lands Alexander once crossed, in your mind's eye. Trace the roads his armies marched, from the coasts of Ionia, through the high passes of the Hindu Kush, down the flowing Indus, and back across the deserts of Gadrosia. Each mile carried not only spears and shields, but also ideas, stories, languages, and dreams. Soldiers traded with locals, scholars scribbled down observations, and priests performed rituals side by side with strangers. The mingling of so many worlds was something no empire had ever attempted in quite the same way. This was the essence of what historians later called the Hellenistic Age. Imagine walking through one of Alexander's cities in those years after his death. In the markets you might hear Greek merchants haggling beside Persian traders, Egyptian farmers selling grain alongside Babylonian artisans, Jewish scholars debating with Indian travellers. On the walls of temples, gods from different lands began to stand side by side, their images blending. Zeus might be carved with the horns of Amun, Apollo might shine with the sun disk of Ra. It was as though Alexander's whirlwind had swept not just armies, but also belief itself, into a single vast conversation. Yet such mingling was not simple, nor always peaceful. Beneath the exchanges of goods and ideas lay tensions. Old loyalties lingered, resentments simmered. The Greeks still thought themselves superior in art and thought, while Persians held fast to traditions of royal grandeur, and Egyptians clung to rituals older than any foreign king. The harmony Alexander dreamed of was fragile, like a glass vessel carried across uneven ground, and in the absence of his steady hand the vessel cracked. The successors quarrelled, each pulling at a piece of the empire. Ptolemy, pragmatic and cunning, took Egypt, where the Nile's steady rhythm offered stability. He guarded Alexander's body too, seizing the golden coffin meant for Macedonia and placing it in Alexandria, making the city not only a seat of power but also a shrine to the conqueror himself. There, pilgrims and admirers could gaze upon the embalmed remains of the man who had once shaken the world. The tomb's location, lost to us now, became one of history's enduring mysteries. Seleucus, meanwhile, claimed the lands of Asia. His empire stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the edge of India, a realm of staggering diversity. He founded cities, minted coins, raised armies. His rule was long and influential, and through him, much of Alexander's eastern vision endured. Antigonus sought to dominate Asia Minor and Greece. Lysimachus controlled Thrace and parts of Anatolia. Cassander took Macedonia itself, ruling the homeland of Alexander with a heavy hand. They fought one another endlessly, battles and sieges spilling across the map like spilled ink. For decades the wars raged, each man hoping, perhaps secretly, that he might rise above the others and wear Alexander's mantle. But the mantle was too heavy, it belonged to no one else. Still, even as they quarrelled, the world Alexander had created grew in new directions. Science flourished in Alexandria's great library, where scholars from across the known world gathered scrolls and debated discoveries. Astronomers charted the heavens, physicians studied the body, mathematicians unravelled numbers that still shape our world today. In sculpture and painting, new styles emerged, portraits showing not just ideal beauty but also emotion, age, and imperfection. Art became more human, more expressive, reflecting a world no longer bound by rigid lines. And beyond art and science, there were stories. Stories of Alexander himself. His campaigns became legends, embroidered by poets, retold by travellers, reshaped with each telling. In Egypt, he was remembered as a son of Amun, almost divine. In Persia, he was remembered with bitterness as a destroyer, the man who burned Persepolis. In Greece, he was celebrated as a hero, though some still whispered of his tyranny. In distant lands, even beyond India, tales of a great king who came from the west spread into folklore. He became not only a figure of history, but of myth, reshaped again and again by the imaginations of later generations. Now close your eyes and imagine the man himself, not as a conqueror in battle, but in quieter moments. Perhaps he's seated in his tent, a map spread before him, candles flickering. His eyes trace rivers and mountains, not yet crossed. He whispers to Hephaestion of new journeys, new lands, dreams of reaching the ocean that circles the world. Perhaps he steps outside, looking at the stars above the desert, wondering if beyond them lay other realms, other gods. For Alexander's restlessness was not only about war, it was about discovery, about the unending desire to see what lay beyond. This restlessness, this fire, was both his gift and his curse. It drove him to greatness, but it also denied him peace. His soldiers longed for home, but he pressed them onward. His friends longed for familiarity, but he adopted foreign customs. His empire longed for stability, but he hungered for more. In the end, the fever that claimed him was perhaps the only force capable of stopping him. And yet, when you think of him now, centuries later, It is not as a man brought low by illness that he is remembered. It is as the rider at the front of the charge, spear lowered, cloak streaming in the wind. It is as the young king crowned pharaoh by Egyptian priests, hailed as divine by oracles. It is as the dreamer who sliced the Gordian knot, who believed no obstacle was too great to overcome. His flaws, his tragedies, his anger, they remain, but they do not dim the light. They remind us he was human, but a human who lived as if touched by something greater. Perhaps this is why Alexander's story endures as a tale not only of conquest, but of possibility. He reminds us of the human urge to reach farther, to cross horizons, to imagine worlds beyond the ones we know. His empire did not last, but the spirit it carried, the mingling of cultures, the spark of ideas, lives on. In that sense, perhaps. Alexander's true conquest was not of land, but of imagination. And so, as you settle deeper into rest, let the noise of battles fade into silence. Let the clamour of swords and cries of armies soften into distant echoes. What remains is the gentle image of a young man riding beneath the stars, restless, radiant, and unforgettable. His story is not merely history, it is a dream, one that has lulled centuries of listeners as they drift into sleep. Let us imagine, for a moment, that the life of Alexander did not end in Babylon, but carried onward in the stories told long after his passing. For in truth, while his body rested in a golden coffin, his spirit travelled farther than even he had marched. His name lived on in tales, in myths that crossed borders, reshaped and retold until the man became larger than history itself. In Greece, bards sang of him as a hero like Achilles, swift of foot, favoured by the gods, destined for glory. They compared his battles to those of Homer's epics, painting him as the living continuation of their myths. To the Persians, he was remembered with bitterness as the destroyer, the man who burned Persepolis and shattered their empire. They called him the Accursed, a shadow across their memory. In Egypt, however, he was honoured as Pharaoh, a son of the god Amun, and stories of him mingled with their sacred traditions. In India, tales of the Western king filtered into legend, reshaped into fables of bravery and folly alike. Across centuries, these stories merged into what became known as the Alexander Romance, a collection of fantastical tales that transformed the conqueror into a figure who explored the heavens, who descended into the ocean in a glass submarine, who spoke with mythical creatures and sought the water of life. These were not true, but they reveal something important. Alexander's memory was too vast to remain confined by fact alone. People needed him to be more than a man. He became a canvas on which cultures painted their dreams and fears. Think of this as you drift towards sleep. A single human life, brief as any, yet so intense that it echoed outward, reshaping imagination itself. Alexander was not only a king of armies, he became a king of stories. Yet let us not lose sight of the real man, for he too was extraordinary. Born in 356 BC in Pella, a small city in Macedonia, his early life was shaped by both privilege and challenge. His father, Philip II, was a stern, ambitious king who demanded strength and discipline. His mother, Olympias, was fiercely devoted, telling him he was destined for greatness. Some even said she whispered that Zeus himself was his father, planting in him a seed of divine confidence. As a boy, Alexander tamed the wild horse Bucephalus, a beast no one else could master. The horse would carry him into battle for years, becoming as legendary as the rider himself. Aristotle, his tutor, fed him not only knowledge of science and philosophy, but also a hunger for understanding the world. Alexander grew into a man who valued both the spear and the scroll, who could lead armies but also paused to discuss the stars or the mysteries of nature. All of this shaped the king who, at 20, took up his father's mantle, and when he crossed into Asia, it was not simply with a dream of conquest, it was with a belief that he was stepping into destiny itself. That belief, whether born of his mother's whispers, Aristotle's lessons, or his own restless spirit, never left him. We might pause here to consider what drove him so fiercely. Was it ambition? The simple desire to rule? Was it revenge against Persia for their old invasions of Greece? Or was it curiosity, the yearning to see what lay beyond each horizon? Perhaps it was all of these, woven together into a single, unrelenting fire. And perhaps that is why his story still captures us, because in him we see both the brilliance and the danger of human longing, the light and the shadow of ambition unbound. Now let us return to the years after his death, when his generals carved the world like hunters dividing a lion's spoils. Their wars, bitter and endless, remind us of how fragile his creation was. Yet through those wars, something unexpected endured, the mingling of cultures he had begun. Greek became the language of learning across much of the East, not erasing local tongues but layering upon them. Temples rose with blended architecture. Statues bore features of both East and West, and philosophies travelled farther than they ever had before. In Alexandria, Egypt, the great library became a beacon. Imagine the halls filled with scrolls, works of mathematics from Babylon, medicine from Egypt, plays from Athens, poetry from India. Scholars walked the colonnades, debating under painted ceilings, their voices echoing into the marble courtyards. Ships from across the Mediterranean docked in the harbour, their captains bringing not only goods but also stories. This was the legacy of Alexander, not merely land but connection. Centuries later, when Rome rose to power, it inherited much of what Alexander had spread. Roman generals studied his campaigns. Roman philosophers debated his choices. Roman emperors sought to emulate his image. Julius Caesar wept, it is said, when he saw a statue of Alexander, for Caesar was already older than Alexander had been when he conquered the world, and had achieved far less. Napoleon too looked to him as an example, as did countless others who dreamed of empire. Even in failure, men measured themselves against Alexander. But Alexander's story is not only for conquerors, it is for dreamers, for those who wonder what lies beyond the horizon. His journey reminds us of both the beauty and the peril of reaching too far, of daring to grasp at greatness. He soared higher than most could imagine, but his fall was swift, leaving others to struggle over the pieces. His life is a reminder that brilliance and fragility often walk hand in hand. As you listen now, let the clamour of battles fade, and let the softer images rise. Alexander laying a wreath at the tomb of Achilles, whispering to his hero that he would surpass him. Alexander pausing in Egypt, gazing at the pyramids that had stood for thousands of years, perhaps realizing that even his greatness was but a breath compared to eternity. Alexander at night, in his tent, eyes fixed on the stars, wondering if the gods listened when he spoke. These are the moments that humanize him, that show us not just a conqueror, but a man who lived with intensity, curiosity, and unrelenting desire. His story is history, yes, but it is also poetry, and like poetry, it has no ending. For though he died young, his name still travels, whispered across time, reshaped in every age. So let your mind rest now, not on the noise of war, but on the image of a rider beneath the stars. Let the story of Alexander drift like a lullaby, carrying you not into conquest, but into dreams. For the greatest journeys are not only across lands, but also within the imagination, where Alexander still rides, forever young, forever restless, forever remembered. As Alexander's memory moved beyond the hands of historians and into the hearts of storytellers, the man became something greater and stranger than history alone could contain. We can almost imagine the storytellers of old, sitting beside fires in dusty marketplaces, or under the painted ceilings of royal courts, taking the known facts of his life and weaving them into something magical. Out of this tapestry emerged the Alexander romance, a collection of tales that, though fanciful, reveals the way generations wanted to remember him. In these stories, Alexander was not only a conqueror of lands, but of the natural and supernatural world. He was said to have descended into the depths of the ocean in a glass vessel, watching fish glide past as if he were the first to see the secret kingdom beneath the waves. Another tale placed him in the sky, lifted by griffins or giant birds, gazing down upon the earth from the heavens. There were whispers that he searched for the fabled water of life, the fountain of immortality, though, like all men, he never found it. These were not truths in the historical sense, but they reveal a different kind of truth. Alexander was remembered as someone who pushed beyond every boundary, not content with what was known, always reaching into mystery. Why did people tell such stories? Perhaps because Alexander's real life already felt larger than belief. To conquer the vast Persian Empire in just a decade, to march across continents without a single defeat, to die so young yet leave a world transformed, it was already a tale that bordered on the mythical. And so, when imagination took hold, It simply extended the arc of what seemed possible for him. If he'd conquered nations, why not seas and skies? If he had carried Greek culture into Asia, why not also discover the hidden truths of the universe in the minds of poets and dreamers? Alexander became a symbol not only of power, but of endless curiosity. Let us linger for a moment with these images. Close your eyes and picture the young king descending in a glass chamber, water pressing against the walls, lantern light glimmering as strange creatures swam around him. Hear the creak of leather as griffins strain against their harnesses, lifting him higher and higher into a vast blue sky, until the mountains below are like children's toys scattered on the earth. Imagine him standing in a dark forest, cupping water from a hidden spring to his lips, believing it to be the fountain of life. These images are dreams, not facts, yet they lull us with the same wonder as starlight. They remind us that Alexander was not remembered only as a figure of war, but as a bridge to the imagination. Of course, the real Alexander left behind a different kind of immortality. His empire did not endure under one crown, but the currents he set in motion rippled outward. The spread of Greek language and thought created new worlds of learning. In Alexandria, that shining city on the Nile, scholars collected knowledge from every corner of the earth. Imagine walking into its library. Towering shelves filled with scrolls, the smell of papyrus and ink, the murmur of voices as mathematicians debate the nature of numbers. Astronomers map the stars. Physicians study anatomy. Poets craft verses to soothe or to stir. Within those walls, the world became connected in a way it had never been before. And that connection was Alexander's true gift. It is said that even centuries later, when Rome ruled the Mediterranean, Alexander's shadow remained. Julius Caesar, on seeing a statue of him in Spain, is said to have wept, feeling ashamed that he had achieved so little by the age when Alexander had conquered the world. Later, emperors studied his campaigns, eager to learn the secret of his brilliance. Napoleon carried his example in mind as he dreamed of empire. Even in modern times, generals and scholars still turn to his life as a guide, a warning, a spark. But while rulers saw in him a mirror of ambition, ordinary people saw something else, a reminder of what a single life could do. He was, after all, only a man, born in a small kingdom, shaped by tutors, loved and hated, prone to anger and sorrow, and yet in the brief span of his years he bent history. He proved that one person's vision, however flawed, could ripple outward and change the world. This is perhaps why his story is told at night, why it slips so easily into the space between waking and dreaming. It is not only a story of war and empire, it is a story of longing, of horizons, of what it means to reach beyond what is safe and known. We do not need to fight battles to feel the echo of his life. We need only to imagine the restlessness in his heart, the way he stared at mountains and rivers and thought, there must be more. Now, as you drift deeper into this tale, let the harsher parts soften. The cries of soldiers fade. The clash of swords grows distant. Instead, hear the quieter sounds, the murmur of water against a glass vessel, the rustle of scrolls in a library, the breath of a horse beneath a starry sky. These are the lullabies of Alexander's story, and when morning comes, and the story of the world moves on, his name will still be there, etched in stone, whispered in legend, carried in the pages of history. For though his empire fell, the dream he embodied, that of reaching farther, of imagining a greater whole, remains, and perhaps that dream, more than his battles, is why we still speak of him as Alexander the Great. So let sleep take you now, with the image of that young king riding ever onward. His cloak billows, his eyes are bright, the horizon stretches ahead. He does not rest, not in history, not in myth. And as you drift into dreams, you follow him too, into the endless unknown. When we think of Alexander, it is tempting to see only the blaze of his brief life. 10 years of conquests, battles that shifted the course of nations, a crown that glittered above all others. But to understand him fully, we must look also at the quieter centuries that followed, when the world continued to turn under the echo of his footsteps. For it was in those years that the true measure of his influence revealed itself, not only in war, but in art, in culture, in the mingling of peoples. Imagine again the cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, with its great harbour, where ships came from across the Mediterranean, their sails bright in the sun. Alexandria in Arachosia, near the mountains of Afghanistan, where traders paused on their way east, bringing silk, spices, and strange animals. Alexandria Escata, the furthest, perched on the edge of Central Asia, looking out toward lands that seemed like the edge of the world. These were not just fortresses or garrisons, they were seeds of connection, outposts where Greek settlers mingled with local populations, where temples to Greek gods rose beside shrines to foreign deities, where markets bustled with a symphony of tongues. The Hellenistic world that grew after Alexander's death was unlike anything before. In Athens, philosophy flourished, but its influence no longer ended at the Aegean. In Egypt, under the Ptolemies, science and mathematics advanced. It was in this era that Euclid wrote his Elements, a work of geometry that would guide scholars for centuries. Archimedes, too, would discover principles of physics that still shape the way we understand the world. These men did not fight on battlefields, but their victories in knowledge were no less enduring, and they lived in a world that Alexander had opened, where ideas could travel farther than any army. Let us walk, in our imagination, through the Library of Alexandria. Shelves stretch high, filled with scrolls gathered from every ship that docked in the harbour. The scent of papyrus and cedar lingers in the air. Scholars move quietly, their sandals soft against the stone, their voices low as they debate. One corner holds works from Babylon, describing the movements of stars. Another contains Egyptian medical treatises, Greek dramas, Indian fables, Persian histories, all gathered under one roof in a city founded by Alexander's will. Knowledge itself became a kind of empire, one not bound by spears, but by curiosity. In the streets outside, one might see a Greek soldier speaking with an Egyptian merchant, or a Persian nobleman bargaining with a Jewish craftsman. Children might grow up hearing lullabies in more than one tongue. Marriages bound families from different lands together. This mingling was not always smooth. It carried tensions, prejudices, rivalries. But it was also rich, creating a world where cultures did not stand apart, but overlapped like colours on a canvas. This, too, was Alexander's legacy. Though his empire broke apart, the connections he forced into existence endured. They remind us that even when human ambition burns too fiercely, leaving ruins and grief, something new may still grow from the ashes. Yet alongside these gifts, we must remember the costs. Cities destroyed, lives uprooted, peoples enslaved, Thebes burned, Persepolis looted, Tyre besieged until its streets ran red. The Macedonian soldiers who marched with Alexander left behind families they would never see again. And when the wars of the successors raged, more blood was spilled, more fields lay fallow, more children orphaned. Greatness, history reminds us, often walks hand in hand with suffering. But for a bedtime tale, let us soften those sorrows not to erase them, but to let them rest instead. Let us hold on to the images that soothe, the gleam of marble temples under the Mediterranean sun, the hush of scholars in the library, the murmur of the Nile as it flowed past Alexandria's harbour. Think now of Alexander himself, as later generations imagined him, not the stern king issuing orders, but the restless dreamer in stories. He was said to converse with philosophers about the nature of the soul, to ask priests about the origins of the universe, to marvel at the customs of every land he entered. Some said he slept with Homer's Iliad beneath his pillow, reading of Achilles and seeking to match his hero's glory. Others claimed he carried strange plants and animals home from his campaigns, eager to learn about the world's wonders. We can almost see him, seated by a fire at the edge of a camp, Bucephalus tethered nearby, a scroll in his hands. The murmur of his soldiers drifts across the night air, but Alexander's eyes are lifted to the stars. He wonders what lies beyond them, whether the gods walk among them, whether the world is infinite. In such moments, he seems less like a conqueror and more like a seeker, a man whose restlessness was as much about knowledge as about power, and perhaps that is why he has never faded. Conquerors come and go, their empires rising and falling like waves, but dreamers remain, because their visions touch something universal in us all. Alexander's dream was vast, flawed, but unforgettable. He imagined a world larger than the divisions of tribe and tongue, and though he could not fully create it, the attempt alone reshaped history. In Rome, centuries later, statues of Alexander stood in villas and forums. Emperors gazed at them, wondering how they might measure up. In medieval Europe, manuscripts of the Alexander romance spread, filled with colourful illustrations of the king riding griffins or battling sea monsters. In the Islamic world, he was remembered as Iskander, sometimes even linked with Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran. In each culture he became something slightly different, moulded to their hopes and fears, but always his name endured. Close your eyes now, and imagine the quiet places of his story. Imagine the hush of the desert oracle at Siwa, where priests whispered that he was the son of a god. Imagine the gentle ripples of the river Granicus, its waters still flowing long after the clash of armies faded. Imagine the whisper of the wind through the ruins of Persepolis, once aflame, now silent under stars. These are the softer notes of Alexander's symphony, the ones that linger when the drums of war have ceased. As you rest, let these images carry you not to conquest, but to calm. Let Alexander's story remind you that history, though filled with noise and clamour, also carries moments of quiet beauty, moments when even the greatest of men pause to wonder at the world. For in the end, perhaps that is the truest greatness, not in the lands he conquered, but in the horizons he dared to imagine. And so, the story continues to drift, across centuries, across cultures, across the pages of history. Alexander the Great, hero, tyrant, dreamer, conqueror, becomes less a man and more a symbol, a star that burned fiercely and then was gone, but whose light still reaches us even now. When Alexander's body lay in its golden coffin, the conqueror himself was gone, yet his story had only begun its second life. History may have ended for him in Babylon, but memory carried him onward. Memory, after all, is not still. It travels, reshapes, grows, and Alexander's memory spread across lands faster than any messenger could ride. In Greece, poets told of him as the heir of heroes. They said he was like Achilles, swift in battle, destined to die young but remembered forever. In Persia, where ruins still smouldered, his name was spoken with bitterness, the accursed, yet even there, the memory was not simple. Some Persians admired his courage, even as they hated his destruction. In Egypt, priests told visitors that Alexander had been chosen by Amun, god of gods, a pharaoh whose spirit joined the timeless cycle of the Nile. And then, centuries passed. Rome rose, new emperors ruled the Mediterranean, yet Alexander lingered like a shadow cast across the centuries. Julius Caesar, when he was a young man in Spain, stood before a statue of Alexander and wept. He was older than Alexander had been when he conquered the world, yet his own name was still unknown. Caesar's tears remind us of something timeless, the way one life can become a measure for others, a mirror in which they see their own ambitions reflected. Later emperors, too, looked to him. Augustus studied his campaigns, dreaming of matching his fame. Caracalla visited his tomb in Alexandria, draping himself in Alexander's aura. The Roman legions, though unmatched in discipline, still read the accounts of Macedonian phalanxes and cavalry charges, seeking inspiration. In Rome's marble halls, his story became a kind of school for ambition. But outside the halls of emperors, Alexander's legend lived in stranger ways. In medieval Europe, manuscripts told fantastical versions of his life. Illuminated pages showed him riding through the skies on griffins, or exploring the ocean depths in a glass bell, or discovering realms of monsters and wonders. The historical battles were still there, the Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, but wrapped in layers of magic and myth. To readers who had never seen the deserts of Persia or the rivers of India, Alexander became not only a conqueror of nations, but an explorer of the very edges of the world. In the Islamic world, too, his name endured. There, he was known as Iskander or Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, sometimes imagined as a righteous ruler who built walls to keep out the forces of chaos. For Muslims, he was not only a warrior but a figure woven into the fabric of spiritual stories, a man who stood at the crossroads of prophecy and history. His journeys were retold as allegories, reminders of human striving and divine guidance. The further the centuries moved from his lifetime, the more Alexander became less a man and more a mirror. Each culture polished that mirror differently. To the Greeks, he was the shining sun of their civilization, proof of their brilliance. To the Persians, he was a wound, a scar, yet also a figure too great to ignore. To Egyptians, he was absorbed into their ancient cycle of kingship. To medieval Europeans, he was an adventurer, a hero who blurred the lines between reality and legend. To the Islamic world, he was a man of destiny, tied to divine plans. What do we make of this? Perhaps that Alexander had become universal. He was claimed by many, reshaped by many, because he had stepped beyond the ordinary boundaries of a single people. He had walked too far, conquered too wide, dreamed too large. His story belonged not to one nation, but to all who heard it. Now let us pause and picture how such stories were told. A scribe in a monastery, dipping his quill into ink, carefully illuminates an image of Alexander beneath the stars, his cloak painted in shimmering gold. A poet in Persia chants verses of his deeds, weaving both admiration and sorrow. A scholar in Cairo copies an Arabic manuscript of the Alexander Romance, its pages filled with strange adventures. A child in Europe, centuries later, listens to a tale of the young king who never lost, who travelled beyond the known world, who sought the water of life. And so Alexander lived on, not in flesh, but in imagination. Each listener, each reader, each teller carried him forward, changing him, reshaping him, but never letting him fade. That, perhaps, is the truest form of immortality. Even today, we see his traces. Historians study his battles. Generals analyse his strategies. Archaeologists search for his lost tomb. Writers and filmmakers retell his story, sometimes as fact, sometimes as fantasy. His name, 2,000 years old, is still spoken, and in that he lingers with us, as vivid as when he first crossed the Hellespont. But let us soften again, for this is a bedtime telling. Let the noise of conquest grow faint, like distant thunder. What remains is the softer glow, the boy reading Homer by torchlight, the rider laying a wreath on Achilles' tomb, the dreamer gazing at pyramids older than memory, the weary king staring at stars above Babylon, fever burning, yet still wondering what lay beyond. Alexander's life was short, fierce, flawed, but also filled with wonder. He reminds us that even the brightest flames cast shadows, but they also light the path for others. His empire did not endure, but the connections it created changed the world. His battles ended, but his legend never has. So rest now, with the thought of a young king whose cloak still rustles in the winds of history, whose horse still gallops through the fields of imagination, whose name still echoes like a lullaby across time. He is gone, but he is not forgotten. He's Alexander, forever great. When the fever in Babylon closed Alexander's eyes, the world he left behind was too vast, too fragile, too full of ambition to hold together. His generals, those companions who had once marched side by side beneath his banner, turned against one another. Yet even as they fought, something quiet and enduring was happening in the streets, in the homes, in the markets of his former empire. A new age was beginning, later called the Hellenistic Age. The word itself means simply Greek-like, but what it describes was something far richer than imitation. It was a world where Greek culture spread, yes, but also where it mingled with the traditions of Persia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India. Imagine walking through a city in this age. A Greek theatre stands in one district, where actors perform tragedies in flowing robes, their voices carrying through open air. In another quarter, Egyptian priests tend to their ancient temples, their chants rising with the smoke of incense. Nearby, a marketplace bustles with goods from every corner. Greek olives, Persian carpets, Indian spices, Nubian gold. The languages spoken overlap like music, sometimes dissonant, sometimes harmonious, always alive. In Egypt, under Ptolemy and his descendants, Alexandria grew into a jewel of the ancient world. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, rose above the harbour, one of the 7 wonders, guiding ships safely to shore. Its library gathered knowledge from far and wide, becoming a beacon of human curiosity. Scholars studied geometry, astronomy, medicine, poetry. They calculated the circumference of the earth, mapped the stars, and wrote verses that spoke of love and longing. In these achievements, we hear echoes of Alexander, not because he created them directly, but because he opened the doors through which such currents of knowledge flowed. In Asia, the Seleucid Empire stretched across lands once ruled by the Persians. Here, Greek and Eastern customs intertwined. Coins bore images of Greek gods, but local deities remained honoured. Soldiers trained in Macedonian style, but markets bustled with Eastern goods. In temples, art began to blend. Greek sculptors carved figures that bore Persian clothing or Indian postures, creating a fusion that was neither wholly one nor the other, but something new. In Greece itself, life had changed too. The old city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, were no longer the sole centres of power. The torch had shifted outward, to these new kingdoms where wealth and culture flowed. For many Greeks, this was both loss and opportunity. They mourned the independence of their polis, yet they marvelled at the wider world they now touched. A young Greek could travel east and find work in distant cities, could serve in foreign armies, could study in libraries filled with scrolls unknown in Athens. The horizons of life had expanded. And so, though Alexander's empire did not survive as one, his legacy breathed in these changes. His dream of uniting peoples had not been fully realised, yet, in a softer way, it had taken root. People began to think beyond the narrow boundaries of their homelands. They tasted foods from distant lands, wore clothes of mixed fashion, prayed to gods that blended traditions. The world was larger now, and Alexander's whirlwind had opened it. But the age was not only about blending, it was also about ambition. The successors, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Asia, Antigonus in Macedonia, each carved kingdoms, each sought to expand, each dreamed still of reuniting Alexander's world under one crown. Their wars continued for generations, battles spilling across seas and plains, sieges rising and falling. To ordinary people, these wars meant uncertainty, new rulers, shifting borders, soldiers passing through. Yet even in these unsettled times, daily life continued. Farmers tilled their fields, merchants sold their goods, children played in the streets. Empires may rise and fall, but the rhythm of human life endures. Let us picture one such life. A young man in Alexandria, perhaps the son of a Greek settler and an Egyptian mother. He speaks 2 languages with ease. In the mornings he studies geometry at the library, tracing lines on wax tablets. In the evenings he walks by the harbour, watching ships from Cyprus, Rhodes, and far off India unload their cargo. At night he listens to his mother's stories of Egyptian gods, while his father tells him of Homer's heroes. He is not wholly Greek, nor wholly Egyptian, but something between, and in him, in countless lives like his. Alexander's dream takes its quietest, most enduring form. Or picture a merchant in Seleucid lands. He rides with caravans that cross mountains and deserts, carrying spices and gems. In one town, he prays at a Greek-style temple, in another at a Persian shrine. He hears many tongues, learns to bargain in many ways. His life is not easy, but it is rich with variety, shaped by the mingling of worlds Alexander once set in motion. In these quiet stories, far from battlefields, we glimpse the softer legacy of the young king who had ridden so far. His empire fell, but the connections remained. They outlived the wars, the quarrels of generals, even the fading of dynasties. They lived in the tastes, the words, the art, the daily lives of ordinary people. And even as these lives unfolded, the memory of Alexander continued to shimmer. In royal courts, kings claimed his image to legitimize their power. In marketplaces, travellers told stories of his adventures, some true, some fanciful. In temples, his deeds were painted into murals, or whispered into prayers. The line between man and myth blurred. Let us pause again, and listen for the quieter sounds. The shuffle of sandals across marble floors in the Library of Alexandria. The laughter of children in a street where Greek and Egyptian words mingle. The steady beat of hammers shaping coins stamped with faces of kings who all wanted to be Alexander's heirs. These are the lullabies of the Hellenistic world. As you rest, remember that Alexander's story was not only about battles, but about bridges. Bridges between peoples, between cultures, between the known and the unknown. His life was short, his empire fragile, but the bridges remained, and across them for centuries. The world walked. As the centuries rolled onward, the Hellenistic kingdoms flourished and faltered, their borders shifting like sands in the desert. And then, from the west, another power began to rise: Rome. What had begun as a small city-state on the Italian peninsula grew, slowly at first, then with unstoppable momentum, into an empire that would rule the Mediterranean. And at every step, Rome looked eastward, toward Alexander's memory. Roman generals studied his campaigns as if they were sacred texts. They pored over accounts of the Battle of Issus, the brilliant manoeuvres at Gaugamela, the bold gamble at the river Granicus. They admired his ability to inspire loyalty, his daring to strike at the heart of the Persian Empire, his refusal to accept limitations. For the Romans, who built their culture on discipline and conquest, Alexander was both a model and a challenge, a man who had achieved in a decade what most empires could not in centuries. Julius Caesar, Perhaps Rome's most ambitious man, once stood before a statue of Alexander in a Spanish town. He wept, for he was older than Alexander had been when he conquered the known world, and he had not yet begun his own march into history. Those tears remind us how powerful Alexander's shadow was, how it weighed upon even the greatest who came after him. Caesar would go on to reshape Rome, to claim his own place among the mighty, but he never forgot that statue, nor the measure it held before him. Later emperors followed the same path. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, looked to Alexander as the symbol of what a ruler could achieve. Caracalla, centuries later, visited Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, yearning to drape himself in the conqueror's aura. Some even tried to imitate his dress, his gestures, his bearing, for them. Alexander was more than history. He was a mirror, reflecting their own ambition. And yet, even as emperors sought to stand in his shadow, ordinary people remembered him differently. His story passed into legend, reshaped by cultures across the ancient and medieval world. In Europe, manuscripts of the Alexander Romance painted him as a knight-like figure, venturing into lands of marvels and monsters. Illuminated pages showed him descending beneath the sea in a glass bell, or flying through the skies with griffins. These were not the real Alexander, but they reveal something deeper. He had become a figure of wonder, a hero who embodied the restless imagination of humankind. In the Islamic world, his name became Iskander or Dul Kanain, the two-horned one, sometimes linked with verses of the Quran. In this telling, he was not only a warrior but a righteous ruler who travelled to the edges of the earth, who built walls to keep out forces of chaos. His story was infused with spiritual meaning, reshaped to guide believers toward lessons of justice and divine will. Think of this for a moment. The same man, remembered in so many ways. To the Romans, he was a model of ambition. To medieval Europeans, he was a knight of wonder. To Muslims, he was a figure of destiny. To Persians, he remained both admired and accursed. To Egyptians, he was a pharaoh, a child of their gods. This kaleidoscope of memory shows us something rare. Alexander belonged to everyone, and to no one. He became what each culture needed him to be. And perhaps this too is part of why his story endures. A man who is only one thing is remembered narrowly. But Alexander, by living so fiercely, by pushing into so many lands, by dying so young, became a canvas for the imagination of all who came after. He was human, yes, but he was also myth. Now let us step back from empires and kings, and think of the quieter lives shaped by his legacy. Imagine a Roman soldier stationed in Syria, centuries after Alexander's death. He walks past statues carved in Greek style, hears prayers whispered to gods with blended names, he eats food flavoured with spices that travelled from India, sees Egyptian glass in the marketplace, listens to music shaped by Eastern scales. He may not think of Alexander directly, but the world he inhabits, the mingled, rich, layered world, is the fruit of seeds planted long before. Or picture a scholar in medieval Europe, copying a manuscript by candlelight. The text is the Alexander Romance, its words a mixture of history and legend. He dips his quill, scratches letters on parchment, and in his imagination, Alexander is not a Macedonian king of centuries past, but a timeless knight-errant, noble and curious. The scholar may never see Greece, Persia, or India, but through the story, he journeys there, in that quiet room. Alexander rides again. Stories have power. They outlast marble. They outlast empires. They outlast even the most glittering crowns. And Alexander's story is proof. His empire crumbled within years of his death. His heirs were murdered. His generals quarrelled. His cities sometimes fell into ruin. Yet the story grew, richer and stranger with each telling. It became not just a tale of battles, but of dreams, of quests, of the human urge to reach farther. Close your eyes now, and picture how his name was spoken in so many tongues. In Greek, Alexandros; in Persian, Iskander; in Latin, Alexander Magnus; in Arabic, Dul Kanain. Each name a little different, yet all pointing to the same figure, the same spark, across deserts, across seas, across centuries. The sound of his name carried, soft and insistent, like a lullaby sung in many voices. And what of his tomb? The golden coffin carried from Babylon. It was said to rest in Alexandria, Egypt, visited by emperors, honoured with offerings. But then, at some point in history, its location was lost. To this day, no one knows where Alexander's body lies. Perhaps beneath the streets of Alexandria, hidden by time, perhaps in some forgotten chamber, sealed by sand, perhaps lost forever, dissolved into dust. The mystery only deepens his legend, for in a way, it is fitting that a man who sought to conquer the edges of the world should himself become unmoored, never fully found, as you drift into rest. Think of that mystery as a gentle image, not a puzzle to be solved, but a dream to be carried. Somewhere. Perhaps the conqueror still sleeps, his golden sarcophagus glowing in the dark, his eyes closed, his story alive only in the voices of those who tell it. And tonight, you have heard it too, carried across time like a whisper from the past. Centuries slipped by, and the Roman Empire itself, mighty as it was, began to fade. Yet even as Rome crumbled, Alexander remained. His story was too deeply sown in memory to vanish. In monasteries, monks copied manuscripts of his life, adding flourishes and marvels. In palaces, rulers commissioned tapestries showing him crowned with laurels, riding Bucephalus at the head of his companions. In villages, minstrels wove songs of his conquests, filling them with dragons, giants, and enchanted rivers. The Middle Ages loved stories of wonder, and Alexander's life, already immense, grew even stranger in their retelling. In some manuscripts, he was said to have built walls at the ends of the earth to hold back chaos and darkness. In others, he ventured to the very edges of the sky, lifted by griffins or by some magical contraption. Still others told of him discovering lands of crystal mountains or oceans of fire. These were not the real Alexander, but they reveal how imagination clung to his name like ivy to stone. He was not simply a figure of the past, he was a vessel for dreams of what lay beyond the known. In the Islamic world, too, his legend flourished. As Iskander or Dul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, he became a figure of wisdom and justice, woven into spiritual texts. He was remembered as a ruler who travelled to the farthest reaches of the earth, who stood at the gates of darkness and built barriers against the forces of evil. In these stories, Alexander was not only a conqueror, but also a servant of the divine. His journeys became allegories, teaching of the fleeting nature of power, the tests of faith, the call to humility. Think of this for a moment. Across Europe, monks painted him as a knight, armoured and noble, while across the deserts of Arabia, poets described him as a righteous wanderer chosen by God. These stories were worlds apart, yet both found truth in his name. That is the power of legend. It does not belong to one place or one people. It travels, reshaping itself with every tongue that speaks it. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, Alexander's memory found new life again. The Renaissance was an age of rediscovery, when scholars in Europe turned back to the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, seeking wisdom long forgotten. And in those writings they found Alexander, not as a myth, but as a man of history, a general whose campaigns could be studied, whose strategies could be dissected. Artists painted him in frescoes, writers praised him in essays. Rulers once more compared themselves to him. It was an age of exploration too. Sailors set out on ships to cross oceans, to find new lands, to map the edges of the earth. For them, Alexander was a companion in spirit. He had pushed eastward, seeking horizons unseen. They pushed westward, across seas uncharted. Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, all carried something of Alexander's restlessness in their voyages, whether they named him or not. His dream of a world without boundaries echoed in their sails. In the courts of Europe, kings sought to cloak themselves in his glory. They commissioned plays and poems comparing them to Alexander. They hung portraits showing themselves in poses reminiscent of the Macedonian conqueror. Napoleon, centuries later, would do the same, carrying accounts of Alexander's campaigns with him on his own journeys of conquest. Always, the shadow lingered. And yet, the Renaissance also brought a gentler image of Alexander. Scholars debated his flaws as well as his triumphs. They asked whether he had been too ruthless, whether he had destroyed as much as he created. They questioned the fire that had driven him. Was it genius, or was it reckless ambition? In these questions, we see a more human Alexander, stripped of myth, considered as a man. The Renaissance mind, always curious, sought to understand him fully, not only as a hero, but as a lesson. Through all these centuries, his tomb remained a mystery. Visitors to Alexandria claimed to have seen it, emperors to have touched it, yet its location was eventually lost by the Renaissance. Scholars longed to rediscover it, believing that within its golden walls might rest not only the body of a king, but the secret to his greatness. Expeditions were imagined, searches begun, but the tomb never appeared. Its absence only deepened the mystery, turning Alexander not only into a figure of history, but into one of the great unsolved riddles of time. Close your eyes now, and imagine these layers of memory like ripples on water. In one ripple, a medieval monk writes by candlelight, drawing Alexander in armour beside mythical beasts. In another, a Muslim poet recites verses of Iskander, the just ruler who builds a wall against darkness. In another, a Renaissance painter sketches Alexander at the head of his companions, sunlight glinting off their spears. Each ripple is different, yet all flow outward from the same stone dropped into history, the life of a young man from Macedonia who dared to chase horizons. And perhaps this is the greatest truth of all. Alexander never belonged to one story. He belonged to many, and that is why he has never faded. His life was history, myth, parable, inspiration. He was a conqueror, a seeker, a hero, a cautionary tale. He was all of these because people needed him to be. As the Renaissance gave way to the modern age, his story continued still. Historians studied his battles with careful detail. Generals mapped his strategies. Scholars traced his influence across languages and cultures. Explorers carried his name into new worlds. Scientists pondered his curiosity. Even today, his legacy shapes the way we think about ambition, about empire, about the reach of a single life. And so, the story lulls on. Soft as the tide, Alexander the Great, once a boy in Pella, once a conqueror in Asia, once a dream in many tongues, remains. His empire has vanished, his tomb is lost, but his name is alive. It drifts like a lullaby through history, whispering not of battles but of horizons. So let the sound of his story guide you deeper into rest. For Alexander's journey, though fierce and fiery in its time, has become gentle now, a story told at night to remind us of what it means to dream beyond boundaries. His cloak still rustles in the winds of memory. His horse still gallops across the plains of imagination. His eyes still gaze eastward, toward the horizon, and as you drift to sleep, you follow him there, into the endless unknown. The Renaissance had breathed new life into Alexander's story, but it was only the beginning of his long afterlife. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, a new kind of curiosity stirred. Scholars began to sift through the myths and the legends, searching for the man within. They asked, what was real? What was invention? What could be known about the young king who had changed the world? Historians in Paris, London, and Vienna pored over ancient texts. They studied Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius Rufus, Diodorus, those old voices who had preserved the fragments of Alexander's campaigns. With the cool eye of reason, they tried to separate the marvels from the facts. No more griffins lifting him into the sky. No more glass chambers beneath the sea. Instead, they sought the strategies, the decisions, the political maneuvers. They wanted the Alexander who marched, who commanded, who built. And yet, even stripped of myth, he remained luminous. His battles were dissected like works of art. The crossing of the Granicus, the daring charge at Issus, the brilliance at Gaugamela. These became case studies in courage and calculation. Military academies in Prussia, France and Britain placed them on their syllabi. Young officers dreamed of leading as Alexander had led, not from behind, but at the front, sharing the dangers of their men. It was in this period that Alexander became not only a hero of poets, but a teacher of generals. Napoleon Bonaparte carried accounts of his campaigns with him, reading them by lantern light in his tent. He sought to emulate Alexander's audacity, his ability to move swiftly, to strike where the enemy least expected. I am a new Alexander, Napoleon is said to have claimed, and in some ways, he was. He marched across Europe, across deserts, across seas, chasing a vision of empire. But even Napoleon, with all his victories, could not match the universal brilliance of the Macedonian king. In Britain, too, generals studied him. As the empire stretched into India, they found themselves marching along some of the very rivers Alexander had crossed centuries earlier. They felt his presence in the land, saw his name carved into memory there. Local traditions still told of Sikandar, the great invader, remembered both with awe and unease. British officers, tracing maps of the Punjab, imagined themselves in Alexander's footsteps, heirs to his restless drive. The Enlightenment, with its love of reason, also asked questions about Alexander's flaws. Was he a visionary or a tyrant? Was he a unifier of cultures, or a destroyer of nations? Scholars debated his adoption of Persian customs. Was it wisdom, seeking harmony, or arrogance, claiming godlike status? They examined his temper, the death of Clytus, the execution of Parmenion, and wondered if greatness always carries within it the seeds of tragedy. In these debates, Alexander became not just a figure of admiration, but of reflection. His story was not only about what he achieved, but about the price of ambition. As centuries turned again, the modern world began to rise. Railways crossed continents, steamships crossed oceans, and suddenly the distances Alexander had marched no longer seemed so unimaginable. Yet rather than diminishing him, this only made him more remarkable. For where trains and ships now carried men, he had gone on foot, on horseback, with only the strength of will to push him forward. Artists of the 19th century painted him in sweeping canvases. Writers filled pages with his exploits, casting him as both hero and warning in Russia, in France, in England. His story was told in classrooms, in drawing rooms, in novels. Each generation found in him a mirror for itself. Ambitious rulers saw in him a reflection of their dreams. Poets saw in him a flame that burned too bright. Historians saw in him a puzzle, half man, half myth. And always, the mystery of his tomb lingered. Expeditions searched Alexandria, hoping to find the golden sarcophagus that had once held the conqueror. Some claimed glimpses, fragments, hints. None succeeded. His resting place remained hidden, as though the earth itself wished to keep him wandering, never fully at rest. In the 20th century, when the world was torn by wars greater than any Alexander had fought, his name appeared again. Military leaders quoted him. Scholars compared modern battles to Issus and Gaugamela. At the same time, new voices rose, questioning him more sharply. Was Alexander truly great, or had history simply glorified conquest? Did his dream of unity justify the blood spilled along the way? These were questions that reflected the modern age. More sceptical, more aware of the cost of empire. Yet even with such questions, Alexander remained luminous. He appeared in films, in novels, in works of history that filled shelves. Archaeologists traced his footsteps through Asia, uncovering ruins of cities that still bore his name. In Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Turkey, echoes of his journey lay hidden in stones, in coins, in inscriptions. Each discovery made the legend more tangible, even as the man himself remained elusive. Think of it this way. Alexander has lived many lives. He was once a boy in Pella, dreaming with Aristotle as his tutor. He was once a conqueror on the battlefield, his spear flashing, his horse charging. He was once a pharaoh in Egypt, a son of Amun. He was once a myth in medieval manuscripts, flying with griffins. He was once a model for Napoleon, a name whispered in war academies. And now, he is a figure in books, in classrooms, in our imagination tonight. Each life is different, yet all belong to him. Close your eyes, and let these lives blend like colours in twilight. See the young king laying a wreath at Achilles' tomb. See the conqueror leading his companions across the Granicus. See the dreamer gazing at stars in Babylon, fever burning, yet still restless. See the legend painted in medieval manuscripts, descending into the sea. See the model studied by Napoleon, the puzzle debated by Enlightenment scholars, the mystery searched for by archaeologists. Alexander has never been only one thing. He's been many things, to many people, and in that perhaps lies his truest greatness. He was not only a man of his time, but a man for all times, a story that could be retold endlessly, each age finding in him what it needed. So let the story quiet now. As the centuries pass like gentle waves, let the battles fade, the empires crumble, the myths soften. What remains is the simple truth. A young man once dreamed beyond the limits of his world, and in doing so, changed it. His empire did not last, but his story endures, flowing like a river through time. And tonight, as you rest, you too float upon that river carried gently by his name, Alexander the Great, a boy, a king, a conqueror, a dreamer, forever young, forever restless, forever remembered. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, the empire he had built in just over a decade stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, but it was also fragile. It depended not on institutions or laws, but on the presence of Alexander himself, his charisma, his authority, his relentless will. Without him, questions arose immediately. Who would rule? How could such a vast land remain united? His generals gathered in Babylon, men who had marched with him from the very beginning. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and many more. At first they attempted a compromise. The throne would pass to Alexander's half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, who was mentally disabled. At the same time, Roxana, Alexander's young wife, was pregnant, and if her child were a boy, he too would have a claim. The generals agreed to rule as regents until the heir was old enough, on the surface. It seemed an arrangement of loyalty to Alexander's line, but beneath it, ambition simmered. Each man had tasted command in Alexander's campaigns. Each now dreamed of more. Perdiccas was chosen as regent, holding power in the name of the royal family, but his position was precarious. Almost immediately, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, seized Egypt, bringing with him Alexander's body. This was not a trivial act. Possessing the conqueror's remains meant more than honour, it meant legitimacy. To bury Alexander in Macedon would have bound his memory to the homeland. By diverting the coffin to Egypt, Ptolemy ensured that Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded, became the site of his cult. From that moment, Ptolemy ruled not only as a general, but as the guardian of Alexander's legacy. War soon followed. The successors, the Diadochi, began to fight, first over regency, then openly for their own kingdoms. Armies that had once stood shoulder to shoulder at Gaugamela now clashed against each other. Alliances shifted, betrayals multiplied. For decades, the Mediterranean and Near East were torn by these struggles. Gradually, three great powers emerged from the chaos: the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire across Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia. Lysimachus and Cassander, too, held lands for a time, but it was these three dynasties that endured the longest. Each claimed to carry Alexander's vision forward, yet in reality, each carved a piece of his empire into its own. Despite the bloodshed, something remarkable took root in this fragmented world. The Hellenistic Age began, not a single empire, but a shared culture, stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Greek became the language of government and trade. Cities founded by Alexander, and later by the successors, became centres of art, science, and philosophy. In Alexandria, Egypt, the Ptolemies built the Great Library, which gathered knowledge from across the known world. Here, scholars calculated the circumference of the Earth with striking accuracy, studied the motion of the stars, explored anatomy and medicine. Poetry flourished, too. The works of Callimachus and Theocritus, gentle verses of longing and beauty, reached audiences far beyond Greece. In Pergamon, another great library rose, rivaling Alexandria, its scholars advancing philosophy and history. Meanwhile, Seleucid kings maintained roads and founded cities across their vast realm. They ruled lands of extraordinary diversity: Persians, Babylonians, Jews, Greeks, and many more. Their coinage carried Greek deities, but their subjects also worshipped older gods, and over time, cultures blended. In Bactria and along the Indus, Greek art mingled with Indian forms, creating the first images of the Buddha carved in a Hellenistic style. The Antigonids, ruling in Macedonia, kept alive Alexander's homeland. Though their power was smaller, their court in Thessaloniki and their presence in Greece ensured that Macedonian traditions remained part of the Hellenistic fabric. This world was not peaceful. Wars continued, cities changed hands, but it was connected. A merchant could travel from Alexandria to Antioch to Babylon and find Greek spoken, Greek-style theatres built, Greek statues standing in public squares, yet he would also encounter local traditions, older than Alexander, still alive, still adapting. The Hellenistic world was not about replacement, but about fusion. Rome, watching from the west, took notice. When Roman legions finally marched into Greece in the 2nd century BC, they entered a world already shaped by Alexander. They admired Greek art, studied Greek philosophy, adopted Greek gods under new names. Rome conquered politically, but culturally, Greece conquered Rome, and behind Greece's reach stood Alexander, the man who had carried its language and customs so far east. Even centuries later, the Romans remembered him. Julius Caesar and Augustus both looked to Alexander as a model. When Caesar wept before a statue of Alexander, it was not only envy, it was recognition of the scale of Alexander's achievement. When Augustus reorganized the empire, he too sought to embody that blend of power and vision. Meanwhile, in the lands once ruled by Alexander, his cities continued to flourish. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. Antioch thrived as a hub of trade. Pergamon developed its own artistic schools. The Seleucid cities in the east stood as outposts of Greek culture in Persia and beyond. All of this was real, tangible, historical, no need for myth. Alexander's conquest created a network of connection that endured long after his empire itself collapsed. The wars of the successors were brutal, but they did not erase what Alexander had begun. Instead, they spread it further. And always, there remained the mystery of Alexander's tomb. Ancient writers tell us that Ptolemy placed the body in Alexandria, first in a temporary resting place, then in a magnificent mausoleum. Roman emperors visited it. Augustus looked upon the embalmed body, while later emperors offered sacrifices. But at some point in late antiquity, the tomb vanished from record, whether destroyed, hidden, or lost beneath centuries of building. It remains one of history's greatest enigmas. Archaeologists still search for it today. In Alexandria, under modern streets and buildings, lie layers of the ancient city. Somewhere. Perhaps the body of Alexander rests. Perhaps not. But the search itself is a testament to his enduring hold on imagination. More than 2,000 years have passed, yet people still long to touch the world he shaped. Alexander's reality is this. He was a man who never lost a battle. He was a king who fused cultures in ways no one had before. He was ambitious, brilliant, and flawed, capable of mercy and cruelty, of vision and anger. He left behind no clear heir, no lasting empire, but he left behind a world forever changed. And tonight, when we speak his name, we speak not of myths, but of history. The dust of his campaigns is real. The ruins of his cities are real. The scrolls written in the Hellenistic libraries are real. His life, though brief, was one of the most consequential ever lived. So as you rest, think not of griffins or fountains of youth, but of real rivers, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Hydaspes, where men fought and history turned. Think not of fantasy, but of stone. The walls of Alexandria, the pillars of Persepolis, the gates of Babylon. These are Alexander's true legacy. They are enough. And in the quiet of night, his story is still a lullaby, the tale of a man who dreamed of the world as one, and who, for a fleeting decade, nearly made it so. The empire Alexander carved in less than a dozen years could not survive his absence. Yet what endured was something more subtle, more enduring than borders, the cultural world historians now call the Hellenistic Age. From the Mediterranean to the edges of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Bactria, Greek language, art, and ideas spread outward, mingling with older traditions. Imagine a city built in this new world. At its centre stands a Greek-style agora, an open square where merchants set up stalls and citizens gather to talk politics. Alongside it rises a theatre, where actors perform tragedies by Sophocles or comedies by Menander. In another quarter of the same city, Egyptian temples still echo with hymns to Isis, Persian fire altars glow with sacred flames, and local shrines honour gods older than Greece itself. Children in the streets grow up hearing 2 or 3 languages. Traders weigh coins stamped with Greek kings but shaped to local standards. This was daily life in the Hellenistic world, a blend, a fusion, a conversation of cultures. One of the most remarkable centres of this era was Alexandria in Egypt. Founded by Alexander, it flourished under the Ptolemies. Its harbour welcomed ships from every shore. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, guided them with a flame visible for miles, a wonder of the ancient world. And above all, its library gathered scrolls from across the earth. Legend says that ships docking in Alexandria were required to surrender any manuscripts on board. Scribes copied them. The originals went into the library, and the copies were returned, whether true or not. The idea reveals the ambition, to collect all knowledge under one roof. In those halls, scholars made discoveries that still shape our world. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth by measuring shadows in different cities, coming astonishingly close to the correct figure. Euclid wrote The Elements, a work on geometry that would be taught for over 2,000 years. Astronomers studied the heavens, mapping stars and planets. Physicians dissected bodies to learn anatomy. The library was not only a storehouse, but a laboratory of thought. And all of it arose because Alexander had once walked through Egypt and declared a city to be built on the Nile's edge. But Alexandria was not alone. Antioch, founded by the Seleucids in Syria, grew into a vibrant centre of trade and culture. Pergamon in Asia Minor developed a library second only to Alexandria's and pioneered parchment as a writing material. Seleucia on the Tigris became a crossroads where Greek, Persian and Mesopotamian traditions met. In Bactria and India, Greek settlers mingled with local peoples, giving rise to Greco-Buddhist art, where the Buddha was first depicted in human form, sculpted with flowing robes and serene expressions in a Greek style. This blending of traditions was visible not only in art and science, but in daily life. In markets, spices from India met wine from Greece. Silk from Central Asia met papyrus from Egypt. In households, Greek pottery stood beside Persian rugs. Marriages between Greeks and locals, encouraged first by Alexander himself at Susa and later by his successors, created families of mixed heritage who carried both traditions forward. The age also brought new philosophies, shaped by the vastness of this world. Stoicism, founded in Athens by Zeno of Citium, taught that the universe was governed by reason and that virtue lay in accepting one's place within it. Epicureanism, by contrast, emphasized the pursuit of tranquility through modest pleasures and freedom from fear. Both schools spread widely, resonating with people living in an age where kingdoms were vast and life uncertain. For soldiers stationed far from home, for merchants travelling endless roads, these philosophies offered comfort, a way to find calm within the storm. Politically, the Hellenistic kingdoms were monarchies, more absolute than the old city-states of Greece. Kings held immense power, supported by armies and wealth, but also by imagery. They were depicted in statues with godlike features. Coins bore their faces crowned with laurel. The idea of divine kingship, drawn from Persia and Egypt, blended with Greek traditions to create rulers who seemed larger than life. This shift, from the collective rule of the polis to the personal rule of monarchs, was one of the great legacies of Alexander's conquests. And yet, life was not only about kings and scholars. Farmers still tilled the land, growing wheat and olives. Craftsmen shaped clay and metal. Fishermen cast their nets. In villages, traditions carried on as they had for centuries, even as Greek words entered the language of trade. The Hellenistic age was not a uniform world, but a layered one. Cosmopolitan cities alongside conservative countrysides, innovation alongside tradition. Still, the sense of a connected world was new. Roads built by the Seleucids stretched across Asia. Ports in Egypt and Phoenicia linked Mediterranean trade to the Red Sea and beyond. Caravans crossed deserts with goods from India and Central Asia. For the first time, people felt part of something larger than their own valley or town, and at the root of it all lay Alexander's Great March, the spark that had set this network alight. Rome, in time, would absorb it. As the Hellenistic kingdoms weakened through wars and dynastic struggles, Roman power expanded. By the 1st century BC, Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and eventually Egypt all came under Roman control. Yet Rome did not erase what it conquered, it absorbed it. Roman architecture borrowed columns and proportions from Greek temples. Roman religion adopted Greek gods under Latin names. Roman education was steeped in Greek philosophy and rhetoric. The very language of science and medicine remained Greek. Thus, even as the last Hellenistic dynasties fell, their culture survived in Rome, and through Rome, in the world that followed. Alexander's empire had died with him, but his vision of a connected world, bound by shared language and culture, endured through channels no army could destroy. Think of this as you rest tonight. Alexander's greatest battle was not only fought at Gargamella or Hydaspes, it was fought in the centuries that followed, in the way his legacy survived conquest, survived collapse, survived time itself. Empires rose and fell, but the Hellenistic world carried forward the spark of his dream. And that dream is still with us. The words of Euclid, the philosophy of the Stoics, the statues of the Buddha shaped in Greek style, all these are echoes of Alexander. They are not myths, but realities carved in stone, written in ink, enduring across centuries. So let the noise of armies fade. What remains is the quiet hum of scholars in Alexandria, the laughter of children in streets where languages mingle, the rustle of scrolls in Pergamon, the creak of caravans crossing deserts. These are Alexander's true legacy, real, lasting, and alive long after his empire was gone. The Hellenistic kingdoms that rose from Alexander's fractured empire were powerful, wealthy, and dazzling in their achievements. Yet they were also fragile. Unlike the city-states of old Greece, with their sense of shared citizenship, these kingdoms were ruled by monarchs whose legitimacy often rested on force and image rather than consent. They inherited Alexander's vision, but without his personal magnetism, their unity was brittle. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty endured the longest. From the throne in Alexandria, generations of Ptolemies ruled as pharaohs, blending Greek customs with Egyptian tradition. They sponsored temples to native gods, inscribed hieroglyphs alongside Greek, and portrayed themselves as heirs to millennia of Nile kingship. The most famous of their line, Cleopatra VII, would one day capture the imagination of Rome and the world, yet beneath the splendour of Alexandria's library and lighthouse, tensions simmered. Greek settlers often enjoyed privileges denied to native Egyptians, creating divisions that would weaken the dynasty over time. In Asia, the Seleucid Empire stretched across vast and diverse lands. It was perhaps the most ambitious of the Hellenistic states, ruling from Syria to Mesopotamia, Persia to Central Asia, but its size was also its weakness. Local revolts flared, distant provinces drifted away, and rival powers pressed at its borders. The Parthians rose in Iran, carving territory from Seleucid lands. In the east, Bactria became independent, a Greco-Indian kingdom that blended cultures in remarkable ways. The Seleucid kings, caught between expansion and defence, struggled to hold their realm together. In Macedonia and Greece, the Antigonid dynasty held power, but their authority was constantly challenged. The old city-states never fully accepted foreign kings. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes longed for their independence, and revolts flared across the decades. To maintain control, the Antigonids relied heavily on armies and alliances, but their position was always precarious. Through the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, these kingdoms fought each other relentlessly. Wars between Ptolemies and Seleucids drained treasuries and devastated cities. Dynastic rivalries led to assassinations, betrayals, and coups. The dream of unity that Alexander had once embodied gave way to generations of conflict. And in the West, a new power was watching. Rome, at first a small republic confined to Italy, grew stronger through discipline, alliances, and relentless ambition. By the 2nd century BC, Roman legions had marched into Greece itself. In 168 BC, at the Battle of Pydna, the Antigonid dynasty was defeated, and Macedonia became a Roman province. The Greek mainland, once the proud heart of Alexander's world, was now under Roman control. The Seleucids lasted a little longer, but their vast territory steadily eroded. Parthians took Persia, internal rebellions chipped away at their power. Finally, in 63 BC, Pompey the Great, a Roman general, annexed Syria, ending Seleucid rule. In Egypt, the Ptolemies clung to power for nearly 3 centuries, their dynasty marked by intrigue and internal strife. Cleopatra VII, the last of her line, allied first with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony, seeking to preserve Egypt's independence. But after her defeat at Actium in 31 BC, Egypt too fell into Roman hands. Alexandria, once the crown jewel of Hellenistic ambition, became a province of Rome. By the dawn of the 1st century AD, all of Alexander's successor kingdoms had been absorbed into the Roman Empire. The dream of a Macedonian empire stretching across continents was gone. Rome, with its legions and laws, had replaced it. Yet Alexander's influence was far from erased. Rome absorbed the culture of the Hellenistic world as eagerly as it conquered its lands. Greek remained the language of learning. Roman architecture borrowed Greek forms. Roman religion adopted Greek gods, giving them Latin names. Zeus became Jupiter. Athena became Minerva. Roman education was steeped in Homer, Plato, and Aristotle, the very thinkers who had shaped Alexander's own mind. Roman generals studied Alexander's campaigns, seeking to imitate his boldness. His life became a mirror for ambition. Julius Caesar's tears before his statue, Augustus's visit to his tomb, emperors who sought to style themselves as new Alexanders, all reveal how deeply he lingered in their minds. In daily life, too, the Hellenistic legacy endured. Cities founded by Alexander and his successors remained vibrant under Rome. Alexandria continued as a centre of scholarship. Antioch became one of the empire's great metropolises. Pergamon flourished with art and learning. Even in the Far East, Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms left behind a cultural fusion visible in art and coinage, influences that survived long after their political power had vanished. This was Alexander's truest legacy, not an empire of borders, but an empire of culture. He had spread Greek language and ideas across continents, but he had also encouraged mingling, creating a world where cultures did not simply replace one another, but fused into something new. Rome carried this fusion forward, ensuring that long after Alexander's name was spoken only in history, the world still bore his imprint. Think of it now, gently, as you drift toward rest. The battles are long past, the kings are dust, the empires have crumbled, yet the ideas, philosophy, science, art, language endured. The stones of theatres still stand in ruined cities, the scrolls of Greek philosophers still whisper wisdom, the statues carved in blended styles still gaze with calm expressions. All of it traces back, in some way, to the restless march of a young Macedonian king. And what of his body? Ancient sources tell us it lay in Alexandria, in a tomb visited by emperors. Augustus is said to have looked upon it. Caracalla offered homage. But then, sometime in the haze of late antiquity, the tomb was lost. No trace has been found. Archaeologists still search beneath the modern city, hoping to discover it. But perhaps it is fitting that Alexander's final resting place is hidden. He was never a man who belonged to one land, his body may be lost. But his story has wandered everywhere, carried on the lips of all who remember. So let the clamour of wars fade now. Let Rome's legions march off into the distance. What remains is the enduring truth. Alexander's empire fell, but the world it created endured, in Rome, in art, in language, in science, in the very shape of the Mediterranean and Near East. His presence lingered. His greatness was not only in what he conquered, but in what he connected. When Rome took possession of the Hellenistic world, it did not erase Alexander's legacy. Instead, it absorbed it. Roman soldiers might speak Latin in their camps, but in the streets of Antioch, Pergamon, and Alexandria, Greek was the language of trade, literature, and philosophy. For centuries, the educated elite of Rome wrote and thought in Greek as much as in Latin. Cicero, the great orator, admitted that Greek philosophy shaped his own understanding of virtue and politics. Roman poets drew from Greek verse forms, Roman sculptors from Greek statues. In truth, Rome conquered the lands, but Greek culture spread by Alexander conquered Rome. Yet Alexander was more than culture to the Romans. He was also a model, a mirror, a standard of ambition. Every Roman leader who sought greatness measured himself against the young Macedonian king. Julius Caesar felt this most keenly in Spain. When he saw a statue of Alexander, he is said to have wept. He was older than Alexander had been at the height of his conquests, yet Caesar had not yet achieved such glory. Those tears were not of despair, but of drive. They reveal how Alexander's shadow pressed upon the most ambitious of men, urging them forward, reminding them that greatness could be seized if one dared enough. Later, as Caesar crossed the Rubicon and began his march to supreme power, echoes of Alexander's audacity were in his steps. Augustus, Caesar's heir and Rome's first emperor, also looked to Alexander. When he visited Alexandria after his victory at Actium, he sought out Alexander's tomb. There, in a golden coffin, lay the embalmed body of the man who had once ruled the known world. Augustus gazed upon it, honouring the conqueror. He is said to have touched Alexander's body, an act both of reverence and of claiming continuity. By connecting himself to Alexander, Augustus cast his own empire as the heir of that earlier vision, a world united under a single ruler. Other emperors followed the same path. Caracalla, centuries later, visited Alexandria and Alexander's tomb as well. Obsessed with the Macedonian king, he imitated his style. Even adopting Macedonian military customs, his fascination bordered on worship, a sign of how powerful Alexander's memory remained. For Roman emperors, to be linked with Alexander was to be cloaked in legitimacy, to stand within a tradition of greatness that transcended time. The admiration was not limited to emperors. Roman historians and biographers studied Alexander in detail. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, composed a life of Alexander that paired him with Julius Caesar, comparing their qualities and choices. Arrian, another Roman writing in Greek, produced the most reliable account of Alexander's campaigns, based on earlier sources now lost. For Arrian, Alexander was not just a conqueror, but a subject of deep moral study. His writings shaped how we still understand Alexander today. Meanwhile, Roman generals carried Alexander's strategies into their own campaigns. They admired his use of speed, his ability to strike at the heart of the enemy, his habit of leading from the front at Gaugamela. Alexander had faced an army twice his size and won decisively. Roman commanders studied the details, seeking lessons for their own wars. But admiration was not blind. Roman thinkers also saw Alexander as a warning. His adoption of Persian customs, his demand for divine honours, his quick temper that led to the death of Clitus. These were seen as flaws, dangers that Rome's leaders should avoid. For every emperor who sought to be a new Alexander, there were senators and philosophers who reminded them of the costs of such unchecked ambition. Even in daily Roman life, Alexander's influence lingered. Coins bearing his image continued to circulate. His cities, still thriving under Rome, carried Greek traditions into the imperial age. In Alexandria, the library and museum remained centres of learning. In Pergamon, art and medicine flourished. In Antioch, Roman governors ruled from palaces built in Hellenistic style. The fusion that Alexander had begun became the foundation of Roman rule in the East, and through Rome it spread even further. When Roman roads carried legions across Europe, when Roman ships sailed the Mediterranean, they brought with them not only Latin law but also Greek thought. A Roman officer in Gaul might quote Homer, a governor in Britain might study Aristotle, a Roman noble in Spain might decorate his villa with statues carved in the Hellenistic style. This was the deeper conquest of Alexander, an empire of culture, invisible yet lasting. Yet the tomb of Alexander remained a symbol of mystery and power. For centuries after Augustus, emperors still honoured it, but sometime in late antiquity it vanished from record. Earthquakes, invasions, and time itself may have swallowed it. Its disappearance only deepened the allure. For if his body could not be found, his legend remained untouchable. To this day, the location of his resting place is one of history's great unsolved puzzles. Archaeologists dig in Alexandria, search ancient texts, follow hints and rumours, but the tomb has never been rediscovered. The conqueror who had roamed the world in life seems to wander still in death. Think of that mystery as you rest tonight. A golden coffin, once visited by emperors, now hidden beneath layers of history. Perhaps under the streets of Alexandria, perhaps lost forever. The uncertainty itself is part of his story. For Alexander never belonged to one land, and even in death, he resists being confined. As the Roman Empire flourished, the memory of Alexander did not fade. He was invoked in speeches, studied in schools, admired and critiqued in equal measure. Rome ruled for centuries, but in its art, its philosophy, its vision of empire, Alexander's imprint was clear, and so the story drifts onward. Alexander, though gone, remained present. His shadow stretched across the marble halls of Rome, his name whispered by emperors, his example studied by generals. His life was short, but his afterlife was long, woven into the fabric of another empire that claimed to surpass his, but never escaped his shadow. By the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire had reached its greatest extent. It ruled lands stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Nile. And yet, within this vast dominion, Alexander's name still resonated. Emperors invoked him, generals studied him, and citizens remembered him as a figure of almost supernatural accomplishment. But Rome itself began to struggle. Civil wars, economic troubles, and invasions pressed on its borders. In those centuries of uncertainty, Alexander's image was invoked not only as an example of greatness, but also as a reminder of fragility. Here was a man who had conquered more swiftly than anyone in history, and yet his empire had not lasted. Roman thinkers used his story to warn their rulers. Victory in battle is not enough. Endurance requires structure, justice, and stability. Still, the admiration never vanished. Coins bearing Alexander's image continued to be minted even under Rome. His likeness, with flowing hair and youthful face, was a symbol of heroic vigour. Roman mosaics depicted him at Issus, charging into battle against Darius. His story remained woven into Roman education. His campaigns studied by officers, his character debated by philosophers. Then came the slow decline of Rome. In the west, the empire fractured in the 5th century. Germanic tribes carved new kingdoms from its lands. In the east, however, the empire endured. The Byzantine Empire, centred in Constantinople, carried on Roman traditions for another 1,000 years, and in Byzantium, Alexander was still remembered. Byzantine scholars copied Greek texts, preserving Arrian, Plutarch, and others who wrote about him. Without their work, much of what we know today of Alexander would have been lost. Meanwhile, in the newly rising Islamic world of the 7th and 8th centuries, Alexander's figure was reshaped once again. In Arabic, he became Iskander, often associated with Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran. Muslim scholars and poets admired him as a just ruler who travelled to the ends of the earth, who built a great wall against chaos. Though this version was coloured by allegory and theology, it was still rooted in the reality of his conquests and travels. In this way, Alexander's legacy bridged not only empires but also faiths. In medieval Europe, his story took on yet another form. Monks and scribes copied the Alexander Romance, a work first composed in antiquity but expanded through the centuries. It blended history with marvels, Alexander exploring the ocean in a glass vessel, ascending to the sky in a chariot carried by griffins, encountering strange lands and peoples to a medieval audience. These wonders were not mere fantasy but moral tales, showing the limits of ambition and the vastness of God's creation. Yet beneath the fables, the historical core remained: a young king from Macedonia who conquered the Persian Empire, who marched as far as India, who died too young. The mythic layers were embellishments, but they did not erase the truth. In both East and West, Alexander thus lived a double life. He was at once a figure of sober history, his campaigns mapped, his battles analysed, and a figure of legend, a hero cast into stories of adventure and wonder. This duality explains why he endured when so many others were forgotten. He could be studied by scholars and embraced by storytellers, revered by emperors and sung by poets. Even the Crusaders, when they marched east in the 11th and 12th centuries, encountered traditions of Alexander along their routes, in the Levant, in Persia, in Central Asia. Tales of Iskander lingered among local peoples, to those warriors from Europe. Alexander was both a distant ancestor of their own culture and a shared figure of the lands they entered. He seemed to belong everywhere. Meanwhile, in Europe's monasteries, illuminated manuscripts depicted him. In one, he wears armour like a medieval knight, his battles transformed into jousts and sieges. In another, he stands beside mythical beasts, his conquests framed as spiritual journeys. These images may not match the historical truth, but they reveal how deeply he was woven into imagination. Through all these retellings, however, the core fact never disappeared. Alexander had done what no man before him had achieved. He had crossed continents, united nations, spread cultures. And though his empire did not survive him, the world he left behind, the Hellenistic world, continued to shape civilization long after his name was wrapped in legend. Think of it now, softly, as though watching history pass like clouds across the sky. In one cloud, you see Alexander charging at Gaugamela. In another, Augustus bending before his tomb. In another, a Byzantine monk copying Arrian's account. In another, an Arab poet praising Iskander as a just king. In another still, a medieval artist painting him in armour. All different, yet all reflections of the same man. And through all of this, the tomb remained hidden. Once so central, once visited by emperors, it slipped from sight. Its absence gave the legends more power. People dreamed of finding it, of opening the golden coffin and seeing the face of the conqueror once more. But the earth kept its secret. As night deepens, let this thought carry you. Alexander was never confined to one age, one people, or one story. His life was real, his battles real, his cities real, but his memory lived many lives, reshaped by every civilization that touched it. He became not only history, but heritage, shared across continents and centuries. And in that, perhaps, lies his truest greatness. Not the size of his empire, but the endurance of his story. Not the gold of his treasures, but the persistence of his name. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was stirring from the long sleep of the Middle Ages. Scholars in Italy, France, and elsewhere began to look back to the ancient world, seeking inspiration from Greece and Rome. They searched monasteries for forgotten manuscripts, copied texts with fresh care, translated works into Latin so they could be read by a wider audience. Among the treasures they rediscovered were the histories of Alexander, Arrian's Anabasis, Plutarch's life, Curtius Rufus's accounts. Once again, the conqueror's true story shone through the layers of legend. For Renaissance thinkers, Alexander was not merely a hero of adventure tales, he was a figure of human potential, of the power of ambition and intellect. Artists painted him in frescoes, placing him alongside Roman emperors, biblical kings, and saints. Writers debated his choices, weighing his brilliance against his flaws. He was studied as a man, not a myth, and yet the aura of wonder still surrounded him. The Renaissance was also an age of exploration. Ships left Europe, sailing into oceans previously unknown. Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa to reach India. Magellan's fleet circumnavigated the globe. To these explorers, Alexander's march eastward was both precedent and inspiration. He had crossed deserts and mountains into unknown lands. They would cross seas. His desire to see what lay beyond each horizon mirrored their own. In their journals and letters, his name appeared, invoked as a guide and a challenge. Rulers of the Renaissance also looked to Alexander as a mirror of power. Kings sought to imitate his charisma and ambition, in France, in Spain, in the Holy Roman Empire. Poets and scholars compared monarchs to Alexander, urging them to emulate his greatness while avoiding his excesses. In Italy, where city-states competed for dominance, leaders invoked him in speeches and art, cloaking themselves in his image. Yet the Renaissance was not blind admiration. Thinkers like Erasmus and Machiavelli examined Alexander critically. They asked whether his conquests had truly benefited humanity, or whether they were driven by reckless pride. Machiavelli, in The Prince, pointed out that empires built by a single man often collapse when he dies, a truth proved by Alexander's own successors. These reflections show how Renaissance minds used Alexander not only as a hero, but as a case study in politics and morality. In art, his image was everywhere. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci sketched designs for battles that evoked the daring of Alexander's campaigns. In Rome, Raphael painted him into the Vatican frescoes, a symbol of classical greatness. Sculptors carved his likeness, blending the youthful features passed down from ancient coins with the idealized forms of Renaissance style. Each work was both memory and reinvention, making him alive again for a new age. The 16th and 17th centuries brought further change. Europe was now colonizing the Americas, establishing empires across oceans. The question of how to govern vast and diverse lands echoed Alexander's challenge centuries earlier. Scholars debated his policy of fusion, his attempt to blend Greek and Persian traditions, his encouragement of mixed marriages, his adoption of some Eastern customs. Was he wise to do so, creating unity through respect? Or had he alienated his own Macedonians, who resented seeing their king dressed in Persian robes? These questions resonated with European rulers who faced similar dilemmas in Asia and the New World. Meanwhile, military leaders studied him with renewed intensity. His tactics at Issus and Gaugamela were analysed in war colleges. His use of cavalry, his coordination of phalanx and skirmishers, his ability to adapt quickly, all were lessons that generals sought to apply. To command like Alexander was to stand at the pinnacle of martial genius. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment cast yet another light upon him. Philosophers, devoted to reason, admired his brilliance but criticised his excesses. Voltaire praised his daring but condemned the destruction he brought. Montesquieu saw in him both the genius of uniting cultures and the danger of unchecked ambition. For Enlightenment thinkers, Alexander was not only a figure of admiration, but also of warning. He proved what one man could achieve, but also how fragile such achievements could be. And then came Napoleon. Of all modern figures, none felt Alexander's shadow more closely. Napoleon carried with him accounts of Alexander's campaigns. He studied the maps, the battles, the strategies. Like Alexander, he sought speed, surprise, and audacity. Like Alexander, he led from the front, inspiring his soldiers with personal courage. And like Alexander, he dreamed not of limited victories but of reshaping the world. When Napoleon marched into Egypt in 1798, he walked quite literally in Alexander's footsteps. He stood among the ruins of Alexandria, gazed at the Nile, imagined himself the heir to the Macedonian king. His soldiers unearthed artifacts, studied ancient monuments, trying to connect themselves to that earlier conqueror. For Napoleon, to be called a new Alexander was the highest praise. Yet like Alexander, his empire burned brightly but briefly, collapsing under the weight of ambition. Even beyond Napoleon, generals across Europe and the world studied Alexander. In Prussia, in Britain, in Russia, his campaigns were dissected in military academies. Officers drew lessons from his daring marches, his flexible strategies, his ability to hold together diverse troops. He remained a living teacher long after his bones were dust. At the same time, archaeologists and historians sought to uncover his world. Excavations in Greece, Turkey, and the Middle East revealed coins, inscriptions, statues. Each find brought him closer, grounding the legend in physical evidence. Scholars debated the reliability of ancient sources, trying to piece together the truest portrait possible. The Alexander they revealed was no longer a mythic hero, but a brilliant, flawed, complex man. And still, the tomb eluded them. Travellers to Alexandria searched in vain. The golden coffin, once seen by Augustus, was nowhere to be found. Some claimed it had been destroyed, others that it lay buried beneath the modern city, others still that it had been carried away. The uncertainty only deepened the fascination. To discover Alexander's tomb would be to bridge myth and history, to gaze upon the face that had changed the world. By the 19th century, Alexander had become a symbol not only for generals and rulers, but for scholars and dreamers of every kind. He was studied in classrooms, painted in salons, written into novels. To Victorians, he was the embodiment of ambition, proof of the greatness that youth and vision could achieve. To critics, he was a warning about imperial hubris, the arrogance of those who believe they can control the world. Both views were true, for Alexander contained them both. Thus, as the modern age dawned, Alexander still walked beside humanity. His campaigns inspired, his mistakes warned, his story endured. He had become not only a figure of ancient history, but a permanent part of human reflection. What ambition can create, what it can destroy, and how the memory of one man can echo through millennia. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Alexander the Great had become more than a figure of antiquity. He was a subject of science, of scholarship, of archaeology, of endless fascination. The modern world, armed with new tools of discovery, sought to peel away the layers of legend and reveal the man beneath. Archaeologists began to excavate sites across the lands Alexander once crossed. In Turkey, they studied ancient cities where his armies had marched. In Iran and Iraq, they traced the paths of his battles against Persia. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, they uncovered coins, statues, and inscriptions from the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms that had arisen from his conquests. Each artifact spoke quietly of the reach of his influence: a Greek inscription in a faraway valley, a coin bearing his youthful profile, a statue blending Hellenistic style with local tradition. The most tantalizing mystery remained his tomb. Scholars debated ancient accounts. Some argued it lay beneath modern Alexandria, hidden under layers of centuries. Others believed it had been destroyed, its treasures lost to time. Expeditions were mounted, maps drawn, tunnels dug. But the golden coffin once seen by Augustus has never been found. Even now, the resting place of Alexander remains one of history's greatest unsolved riddles, and perhaps that mystery, unsolved, is part of why his story endures. To search for Alexander's tomb is to acknowledge that his presence still lingers, that we still long to connect with him across the gulf of time. Meanwhile, historians studied him with fresh eyes. They questioned not only his victories, but also his motives, his policies, his humanity. Some praised him as a visionary who sought to unite cultures. Others condemned him as a ruthless conqueror whose ambition cost countless lives. Modern scholarship has revealed his complexity: brilliant yet flawed, merciful yet cruel, far-sighted yet impulsive. He was not a god, not a myth, but a man, and that is perhaps what makes him most compelling. In the 20th century, as the world faced its own wars and upheavals, Alexander's story was revisited again and again. Generals compared campaigns to his as seeking lessons in strategy. Leaders studied how he inspired loyalty among his men. Philosophers pondered his insatiable ambition, asking what it means to desire so much, to never be satisfied, to dream beyond the limits of the world. At the same time, his story entered popular culture. Films depicted him, novels retold his conquests, children learned his name in schools. He became a household figure, not just for scholars but for ordinary people. His life, condensed into images of battles and maps of conquests, still captured the imagination. And yet, when all the layers are stripped away, what remains is something simpler. Alexander was a boy born in Pella, tutored by Aristotle, who dreamed of greatness. He became a king at 20, led an army across continents, never lost a battle. He died at 32, his body carried to Egypt, his empire divided. His life was short, but its impact was immense. He connected worlds that had long been separate. He set in motion exchanges of culture, art, and knowledge that reshaped history. Today, when we speak of the Hellenistic age, of the spread of Greek language and thought across the ancient world, we are speaking of his legacy. When we admire the Library of Alexandria, the art of Greco-Buddhist statues, the fusion of East and West in ancient cities, we are admiring what his conquests made possible. When we study Euclid, Archimedes, or the Stoics, we see the fruits of a world connected by Alexander's whirlwind. But we must also remember the cost. His march left cities in ruins, populations enslaved, lives shattered. Thebes was destroyed, Tyre burned, Persepolis looted. The glory of his achievements came at a human price. To remember Alexander fully is to hold both truths, the brilliance and the brutality, the vision and the violence. Perhaps that is why he remains so enduring. He was not simply a hero to be admired or a villain to be condemned. He was both, and more. He embodied the contradictions of human ambition, the desire to create and the power to destroy, the yearning to connect and the temptation to dominate. He was larger than life, yet deeply human, and so his story continues to whisper to us. Not because of the lands he conquered, they have long since passed into other hands. Not because of the empire he built, it dissolved within years, but because he dared to imagine more, and in that daring he changed the world. Think of him now, not as a general on the battlefield, but as a figure beneath the stars. Perhaps in Babylon, in those final days, fevered and restless, he looked upward at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond, just as he had always done. Perhaps he thought of the oceans he had not crossed, the lands he had not seen. Perhaps, even at the end, he was still dreaming, and tonight, as you drift into sleep, you carry that dream too. Alexander's story is not only about conquest, it is about the horizons we long to reach, the questions we long to answer, the restless spark within us that seeks more. His empire is gone, but that spark remains in every age, in every heart that looks beyond the known. So let the story rest now. Let the armies fade into silence, the cities into dust, the tomb into mystery. What remains is the gentle truth. A young man lived, dared, dreamed, and died, and the world was never the same. That is enough. Alexander the Great, brilliant, flawed, unforgettable. His life ended long ago, but his story endures, a lullaby of ambition and wonder, carrying us into the quiet of the night.